Valentine's Day. I'd like to welcome you to what is going to be an extraordinary session. For me, a completely dream session, in that we have some guests here today, and I couldn't have imagined any better guests to address this topic, AI and neuroscience. This is, in some ways, an echo of an earlier debate that went on during the summer between Refik Anadol and Anil Seth. It was an extraordinary debate and discussion in itself. We're adding Memo Acton this time, and a few others will be joining us as well, which makes it into a really interesting sort of panel. Let me just say a few things to introduce our guests. Refik Anadol, in a way, needs no introduction to this community. He was with us just yesterday and has an enormous following in the world of architecture. He's not an architect, but he uses buildings as his material, and he uses buildings as his canvas. And he's certainly inspired a whole generation of architectural students from across the world. I should say that he comes from Turkey, as does Memo Acton. And he came across and I found out yesterday that he was Greg Lynn saw some of his work in one of his projections in Istanbul, and suggested he came to UCLA. He came across to UCLA in 2012 and arrived at the airport in the early hours of the morning and got in a car and drove directly to Frank Gehry's Walt Disney Concert Hall. He had been so inspired by this in Turkey, and inspired also by the myth of Blade Runner. He got there and found the building with the lights off and asleep. And one of the most amazing things he's done in his career was to bring the Walt Disney Concert Hall alive with a series of projections. But there are many other things that he's done alongside that, and it's a great honor to have him here. The architectural community in Melbourne, Australia, is now raving about his recent installation, quantum dreaming, that's on there at the moment. It's a great honor to really have Refik. I'm a great fan of his. Anil Seth, likewise. I mean, my students, I show my students every single semester this unbelievable TED talk that Anil Seth has done, and which I think is extraordinary. It's no surprising there are 11 million people who watched it. It's really very special. But to give him Anil is a serious scientist. He's a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, where he's the co-director of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science and the co-director of the CIFAR program on brain, mind, and consciousness. He's also the co-director of the Leverhulme doctoral program from sensation and perception to awareness. He is editor-in-chief of Neuroscience of Consciousness and an engagement fellow at the Wellcome Trust. I should also say that he's a colleague of Andy Clark, who is a good friend with the Digital Futures community, having come to Shanghai, I think, 2 years ago, and a huge inspiration behind many of the people on our panel today, including Ben Asfarai, I think. Memo Acton is another person whose work I found absolutely astonishing, and it's a great privilege to bring him here, to have him here today. Memo is also from Turkey. The question that we raised yesterday: why is so many talented people coming out of Turkey? He trained as an engineer, came across to London, and started experimenting straight away, working with new media and working in the field, I guess you call it media art. He set up a company called Martian Manor Laser Feast, which an interactive design company that was extraordinarily pioneering in what it did with drones and so on in the early days. Thereafter, he sold that company and moved on, and he's just completing now a PhD in Goldsmiths in the computer science department, no less. He's about to come to the University of California, San Diego, where he'll be joining Ben Bratton in what is an astonishing lineup in that particular department of art. I would describe Memo as a polymath. He's somebody who's a bit like, let's see, Alan Turing, has been dabbling in all sorts of fields. I'm also glad to welcome here today some of the people we've had in the past. Welcome them back: Emmanuel Coe, Matthias Del Campo, and a few others who are kind of AI experts in the field of architecture. Wan Yu He as well. I'm glad also to welcome Maria Kopsova, who will be presenting on Saturday the Russian section on digital futures, which I'm looking forward to immensely. I'm also very pleased to have Alexa Carlson here, who has been, who is an engineer, who has been working, collaborating with Matthias Del Campo in Michigan, producing some astonishing results. She has been contributing also over the years to this project. And I'm hoping also, well, Sofia Crespo says she'll be joining, which is amazing because Sofia's work is absolutely stunning. We saw her on Digital Futures a while back. And anyway, the idea behind this is to our project is kind of growing out of the Digital Futures project in the sense that we're trying to establish a global classroom. In Digital Futures, it became clear to us that we were no longer constrained by by the walls of a classroom. We could break open and we could open up in all sorts of ways to reach out across the world to people in maybe less economically fortunate communities and bring educational ideas to them for free. And this is, I think, the premise behind Digital Futures in many ways, the idea that education should be a right and not a privilege. And we're working towards the idea of a global classroom. This particular course, which is part of the doctoral design program at Florida International University, is being used as a kind of prototype to try and explore the possibility of how we can construct a global platform for a doctoral course that can be shared across the globe. And Philip Yuan and I are hoping to, shortly to hoping eventually to try and establish something that becomes more than just a kind of an extra, like TED Talks, but actually becomes integrated into the curriculum of various schools. I should just mention very briefly, this is some work coming out, Maria, from my thesis studio at FIU, from a workshop that was run by Daniel Bolajan, who is also here today and has been instrumental in developing AI for architects. Let me stop sharing and to say that the idea today is to have two sections. We'll start off with Memo presenting some of his work that's kind of inspired in some way by his interest in neuroscience. Then we'll have Anil Seth kind of giving an overview of his particular project. And then we'll have a discussion for about 45 minutes. And then I want to re-inject some more with Memo and presenting some of his extraordinary work. And I will follow up, trying to sort of draw out the relevance of much of this stuff for architecture. And we hopefully will be able to wrap up in 2.5 hours. It's an amazing panel today. We'll start with Refik and Anil Seth, relatively short presentations to leave time for discussion, and then we'll come back and have Memo. And I'm trying to persuade Sofia Crespo, if she joins us, to come and show some work as well. Refik, thank you so much. I think what I really appreciate about your work is not only the incredible modesty with which you present your stuff, but the generosity to share these ideas. And I know that you've been fully supportive of our kind of global classroom idea of bringing this idea to other communities across the globe.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'm extremely honored and extremely excited to be here all together with wonderful minds. Really, really deeply honored. Again, Neil, thank you very much for organizing this. Much appreciated to all this, everyone's being together today. May I share my screen? Start.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so quickly from the yesterdays and a little bit like maybe quickly, again, good morning from Los Angeles, California. At the moment, almost 6:12 a.m. And I'm so happy to be connected with everyone here that I'm inspired and deeply, deeply appreciate the work and the ideas they have. I'm for the better works, for people who are watching first time, the videos will be completely low FPS. So if you're interested, the website here is pretty much holds all these video files, hopefully in a better format. I'm currently teaching, and actually last 6 years teaching at UCLA, DMA, where I got my second degree, and work with Casey Rias, Christian Moller, Jennifer Steinkamp, and many wonderful minds, where I got my second MFA degree to really deep dive into the public art practice. But really very cliche start for me was Blade Runner. I was 8 years old, and I just like learned about many things about science fiction, about near future, downtown Los Angeles, 2019 November experience, and many others such as androids and their potentials and what happens with like what a machine can do do with someone else's memories, I think, context. But over the years, I was really much more inspired about how technology defining who we are again, and how these systems are transforming our DNA and gene, how we are becoming new entities with the help or without help of these systems and softwares and algorithms and hardwares. And most likely my interest about architecture start to appear when I learn about these distinct or very similar experience between physical and virtual worlds. The sense of displacement became a big inspiration, the feeling of not being able to know sometimes where we are exactly located, and how it's actually defining and reconstructing the concept of design and art. And here, one of my probably very fundamental uh, lovely quote that I saw from John Mayer: design is a solution to a problem, art is a question to a problem. And I found in my practice that not only just creating a problem or a solution, they sometimes symbiotically work together, in at least in the media art context. Especially in the work that I'm trying to understand, instead of like a one simple question, I just start the journey maybe a little bit larger view. What does it really mean to be a human in the 21st century is the big umbrella, but I'm understanding to this question. I'm trying to understand this question by literally understanding what happens a human, a machine, and an environment interacts with each other, and how this can create a symbiotic relationship. And it was a very exciting finding early 2008 and 9 that I started my journey. In 2008, I started using a software called VVVV, which is my very early step into the custom programming languages to start my practice in creating like custom softwares. And right now I am on the shoulders of many giants. These are my like current my studio team members. We can speak 14 language. We are 14 people and represent 10 countries. This is one of the reasons behind this is clearly become a studio where our practice is for anyone, any age, and any background around the world. And to make this happen, we mostly practice in public space, mostly create installations by using projection technology, LED technology, or even recently working with technology partners and companies. But we're not doing anything commercial. We do purely art practice. But it's a really unique opportunity to work with wonderful people around the genius minds behind many tech giants. And luckily, our practice over the years reach many locations in the world. And this is one of the reasons I found that the more we are accessible, the more our works are accessible, the more we became more purposeful and try to be more impactful and be educative about our works. Recently, last year, as we all know, the pandemic really was a heavy one, but we were even able to collaborate with wonderful other fabrication techniques. We were able to use lower dimension reduction techniques and 3D print some large-scale sculptures in public space. We are currently still working with NASA GPL, which is allowing me and my team to deep dive into 60 years of NASA GPL archives to understand and analyze the 60 years of archives of NASA GPL. And I think what was really inspiring in last, especially 5 years, is truly because of my residency 2016, thanks to Mike Taika, Kenrick McDowell, and Blair Aguirre Arcas, I was one of the early generation artists in residence at Google AMI. And 2016 for me was a dream year because as a media artist who have been using data in some capacity, was the first time learning what AI truly means and how it can be used practicing and how it can actually learn not too hard. And I learned about Python, which is a language that I know that many students at the moment is learning also. And last now 5 years, I am truly into the generative algorithms and their potentials. As a studio, we are very much practicing with collective memories, I'm calling them, because they are not privatized data, most likely. They are pretty much data sets for humanity I'm most likely looking for. And I'm trying to detach ego from data to be able to find the new narratives inside them with the help of machine intelligence. We worked with archaeological information before, and over the years, and wonderful support came from the Frank Gehry's, Hadid Architects, and many others, that we also merge our practice with architecture. But I think today, and also Anil said here, and a fantastic inspiration also comes from here, machine hallucinations was a kind of a childish dream, I guess. Like, what happens if one day a machine can dream or hallucinate? And I know it's just a speculation. I'm the scientist. I'm a pure artist here. I'm just speculating this concept through the lens of available tools and create narratives in the form of arts. But I was extremely inspired by many research, especially progressive GANs and before DC GAN, cycle GAN, pix to pix, and especially style GAN and style GAN 2 and ADA, for if there's any like friends practicing and technically. And I was very fortunate 2017, early 17, I met with Jensen Huang, NVIDIA CEO, And with his support and his team's support, we grow in a very different way as a studio. And their support, not only hardware, software, allow me and my team go deeper, but also accessing different types of training ideas. So we sometimes bend the models, we reconstruct them by new code, we technically go beyond what is available online, and we even develop our own softwares, which allows us to navigate in latent space. The concept of machine hallucination for me is not simply moving in a latent space, which maybe for the first time here, it's a kind of a, by the way, Memo Acton has an incredible Medium post about this also, explains in a much simple and clear way, is I was fascinated when 2016 learned about like there's an n dimension potential so when a machine can learn in certain algorithms. And for me, from an architectural point of view, how on earth can you draw a plan or section in a space that even cannot be perceived by human perception? And since then, I guess that's 5 years, I'm constantly understanding how can we navigate this universe. And neuroscience is clearly, in my practice at least, remembering, learning, and the concept. As a human, our cognitive capacity is an incredible source of inspiration. And speculating these concepts allow me also to develop this software called latent space browser. For me, when a machine hallucinates, is a truly a human interpretation also at the same time. At the moment, what you are seeing is our one of those early, like 2017, 18 edition of the software, technically an AI model trained on an data set of Renaissance architecture. And I am using a USB joystick and technically flying in the latent space in 3-dimensional projection, finding certain points and letting machine to complete in between latent space walks. But there's a purpose and there's a narrative and there's a kind of a constant search for a new narrative. And 2017, 18 was early years of understanding this, and over the years we developed this and then turned into many others. But of course, architecture, and I found many heroes, and I found that maybe going back to the heroes like Zaha Hadid, Tadao Ando, Frank Gehry, Toyo Ito, and just try to go back their body of work, early 18, 19, and even 17, and remember their body of work and just understand what was the inspiration that truly captivated. And specifically, space research was much more inspired about our common, or as humanity's most important question, maybe also about space is like, is it our next home? Do we need to go there? Are we like safe here? Are we creating a safe nature in our own land or our own earth that is, I mean, anyways, but the question is here, I think, how can we use collective memories in this context and try different ways of viewing latent space? And here we are seeing 3-dimensional augmentation of 3D spaces. I think spatial recognition of the latent space, plotting in an archaeological ways that the same maybe latent space have different ways of seeing it, and understanding time as well in a space that is n-dimensional. And these studies will eventually evolve into a lot of fluid dynamics. I think last 9 and 10 years, maybe a decade, I'm obsessed with fluid dynamics and their potentials and their beauty and their meditative state of, like, I guess, an experience, and also explored what happens if we, I mean, a location we cannot maybe go, but perhaps we can speculate alternative landscapes. And these theories are evolving over the years. And even for 2019, we just challenge ourselves and download 113 million images of city of New York, and heavily using social media and experiencing like somehow cleaning data process. And here machine hallucination reached to a level that was now a 3-dimensional installation in Chelsea Market. This project was, I think, our before pandemic, let's say 2020 February, almost a year ago, closed, unfortunately. But this project was our probably big take about, like, you know, in this scene you are seeing VGG16 and neural network and becoming a 3-dimensional space. There are moments of witnessing the steps of learning rates of a StyleGAN algorithm, or we are witnessing some UMAP TSNE lower dimension reduction of that data sets and its kind of parameters publicly exposed. Like, we are trying to narrate a kind of a language with these, you know, algorithms and their vitals, and transform them into 3-dimensional experiences. And I think it's a form of, I think, again, speculation, but I found a very potentially rich dialogue between the audience from many different age and background. Being inside a lower dimension reduced 8 million images and its reaction on the human mind is something interesting research. But over the years, I guess, as Neil mentioned, a dream project, thanks to Frank Gehry's support and LA Philharmonic and the City of Los Angeles, as an artist practicing in public space, this was a dream project. And the question was, for an institution like LA Phil for 100 years, the big question for me 2012 when I saw the building, can a building learn and can it dream? And this memory, remembering, learning, and the dream or hallucination concept was a very fundamentally speculation. But to make it happen, we also push other boundaries of physics, such as finding, Frank Gehry's incredible compound curves and reflective surfaces has to go through many other, engineering research, such as where to put projectors to augment it meticulously and find a way of narrating a sci-fi experience in downtown Los Angeles where the Blade Runner was going away. But I cannot say it's just a simple AI research or a simple three-dimensional augmentation of a surface. We really went through the historic materials. 2018, 2003, like for 15 years, this building hosts many performances, and we really focused this narrative from a fundamentally whatever we could get from LA Philharmonic archives. Every single performance, every single event, before, after, and even the camera recordings of stage, as much as vitals we can get from the building. And thanks to Parag Mittal joined us, we also transformed their sound archives, which was an incredible sound archive. The building synthesized, which, by the way, Karen McDowell and I found this, maybe speculation, synesthetic architecture, a space, a special experience. The materials, like the logic is not anymore concrete, steel, or glass, but here light becomes a material, and light, I think, still one of the most inspiring material that allows us to go beyond physics and its quality of imagination and its gravity's problems. But here, what was really inspiring for me is finding a kind of a new narrative, which a technique is used decades, and many pioneers involved in the projection mapping in public spaces. But for me, truly seeing through the building and truly collaborating with the architect and the institution and touching every single archival data to generate a conscious model for the building with the purpose of this augmentation was the challenge. It took 1 year, and 1 year of research was truly very heavy, but the result was beautiful. We witnessed more than 100,000 people for free, a public space open up to the audience in Los Angeles. And for me, this is one of the most machine hallucination reach level of imagination when an AI, an architecture, and a media arts in public space and come together in the form of experience. So I'm deeply grateful to Anil Seth for his inspiration and wonderful people here who have been practicing in a similar domain. And now I think today I'm so grateful to be here with many people who are most likely imagining in a similar domain. And also recently, this project evolved into a little bit more complex imagination. Google AI quantum team reached last summer and asked for another kind of a collaboration state. And I was heavily inspired by Alex Greenland's Ex Machina, but especially devs, and inspired from the Hugh Everett's Many Worlds interpretation. And we were able to use a Google AI Quantum Advantage research data set of 9 gigabyte probabilistic noise data and transform a kind of a new ways of looking latent space. We were able to inject the quantum noise to the latent space and even re-inject some new ways of understanding or a speculation of in every single measurement in quantum state and its potentials in alternative reality. So at the moment we are researching with the same team and understanding what else can we visualize from a state of probabilistic reality from the lens of a quantum computation, and how can we correlate Hilbert space and latent space and see if they can inspire each other or in any way, in mathematically impossible, but how can we look at these alternative universes if they exist, and media art and architecture, can it be a lens, another machine to invent? So thank you very much for listening, and I'm so inspired and be here with the wonderful minds today. Thank you.
Thank you, Refik. Every time I see your work, I'm just blown away. And I have to say that my students were too. We were there actually for your Disney Hall projection, and it was extremely inspiring. And I love the fact that you're making it available for free for the public. That's an incredible gesture. So I'd like to invite Anil Seth to say a few words. For those who've just logged on, I want to quickly welcome Philip Yuan, my colleague from Digital Futures, who's here, has just joined us now. Anil Seth and Refik had a fantastic discussion with Chris Moon, who's here as well, and Daniel Bolajan in the summer. A really amazing discussion about the link between the two, and I think we're in a situation where we can both kind of build off that and revisit that as well. So Anil, I'd like to welcome you to share your screen.
Thank you, Neil. Let me just do that then. Advanced, oops, portion of screen. Hold on. Let's get back to Keynote Play. Is that working? Can you see
yes.
the title slide? Great,
yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to return to discuss with you and Refik and others. I felt like a total outsider last summer, and now I feel like almost a complete outsider, but slightly less of one. So I guess that's improvement. But it was a wonderful discussion. I'm really grateful for your bringing me into it. And Refik, it's great to see you again. I hate going after you though when talking, because your presentations are not only thought-provoking, they're insanely beautiful. And I already know that I'm going to fail on at least one of those benchmarks. So, but with that out of the way, oh yes. I have this book coming out. I'm going to advertise it because what the hell. Book is coming out in September. I think you can pre-order it now, but it's sort of my journey through the science of consciousness over the last couple of decades. Okay, so I wanted to start actually just with a quote from Neil, since he sort of brought us all together. And I noticed this in the preface of his 2006 book. And it's about the book. It says, the book Camouflage is addressed perhaps less to architecture itself than to the subjective processes by which human beings experience architecture. And I think, oh, okay, now I understand, now I get it a bit. That's kind of, so I'm certainly on that side of the coin. And my background is as a cognitive neuroscientist, but one who's worked in a very multidisciplinary arena and a lot of collaborations with artists and all sorts of people, creative people, and hopefully with some of you as well in the future too. But my core expertise and motivation is to understand how subjective experience happens, what shapes it, what constrains it, how variable it is among people, how we can use AI and machine learning these days to shed light on some of these questions. Now, I always usually start just by a little example of something that's very, very well known, but is always striking to appreciate in the first person, which is this separation between what's out there, and we don't really know, of course, what's out there, and what we perceive. And in this case, this is an illusion called the lilac chaser. It's a very familiar illusion. If you just stare at the black cross for a little bit and try not to blink or move your eyes, you should see it be replaced by a green patch that goes around in the circle. But then if you blink and move your eyes, the green disk goes away and all the magenta disks return. Of course, there is no green disk. There is no green disk at all. Your brain is inferring the presence of a movement based on a number of factors, which we can talk about later if you want. But the point is, we see a green disk, the green disk doesn't exist. And this, the larger point is that this applies not only to peculiar situations like illusions, but it applies everywhere and all the time to everything we experience, including the self. I mean, everything is a prediction. Everything bears this indirect relationship with whatever is out there. This is, again, not a new idea. You can go to Plato, you can go to Kant, you can go to Helmholtz. The underlying idea that's been sort of progressively elaborated through all these stages in intellectual history is that your brain is a prediction machine. And that perception, what we see when we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we smell, is always this process of inference in which the brain is combining this noisy and ambiguous and, very importantly, unlabeled sensory data, which is just electrical signals. It's combining this noisy and ambiguous sensory data with prior expectations, baked in, if you like, and also learned about the structure of the causes of this sensory data, about the structure of the world and of the body. And it's using these prior expectations to shape, or indeed, I would argue, to actually build predictions about the causes of these sensory signals. And that is what we perceive. the key thing here is we don't read out sensory signals. It seems more natural to think of perception as this process of a readout. Sensory information comes into the eyes, and we sort of extract different parts of it as it percolates deeper and deeper into the brain. And in some sense, the brain is like pulling information out of the visual stream, much like fishermen might pull fish out of a river as it flows along. But it's not like that, at least I don't think so, that in fact, this bottom-up stream of sensory information is just, or mainly it's prediction error. It's just reporting the difference between what the brain gets, what it expects at various levels. And what counts as error, of course, depends on what you predict, and what you predict depends on many things. It's not necessarily the goal for the brain to make the most accurate depiction or representation of the causes of sensory information. What the brain predicts depends on what the brain desires, what the brain needs. So it's understanding this dance between prediction and prediction error and how that shapes our experience of the world and the self is the sort of principle that I've been exploring, certainly over the last 10 years or so. This process of updating perceptual predictions through prediction errors, this is actually, you can understand it from a number of different perspectives. You can understand it mathematically as performing Bayesian inference. Now, Bayesian inference is a way to reason with probabilities. It's sort of the way to think about technically what we mean by something being a best guess. You have some uncertain data, you have some uncertain knowledge about the way the world is. How do you combine these things to get your optimal best guess? In sort of philosophy of reasoning, we would call this abductive reasoning rather than deductive or inductive. It's inference to the best explanation. So the brain is doing this inference to the best explanation over sensory data to define what we perceive. Helmholtz, I already mentioned, was the key figure who applied this to perception, how the brain does perception. He thought perception was a process of unconscious inference, because of course we're not aware of this mechanics of this happening in our brain. We're only ever aware of the result. Probably the dominant framework for thinking about this is, how does the brain actually do this? Well, it's through this continual process of minimization of prediction error, where predictions flow from the inside out, the top down, and prediction errors flow from the bottom up or the outside in. And this dance is regulated by what we call precision. It's a bit like paying attention. When you pay attention to some sensory signals, you increase their weighting, you increase how much they affect the brain's best guess. And we can understand a lot about perception and differences in perception through understanding this how precision is being engineered by the brain for the brain. I think I've mentioned this already. Just the key point is really that perception comes from the inside out rather than the outside in. And that, from that, everything else follows. Now, a lot of the stuff we do in my lab is trying to put all this on a bit of a firm empirical grounding. And there are many ways to do that. This is just one example of a simple experiment where we ask the question, okay, if all this is the case, then you might predict that we should consciously see what we expect more accurately and more quickly than what we don't expect. And so this is one way of testing this. We give two images, one to each eye, in this case, a face that appears in one eye and a changing bunch of colored squares in the other. And we cue people to expect either the face or something else, like a house. And it turns out that if the prediction is valid, people see it more accurately and more quickly by a small but reliable amount. So this is sort of showing in practice that we see what we expect, not what we don't expect. We see that too, but it takes slightly longer. But perhaps more interesting for today is, can we go a bit further and try to understand more subtle aspects of perceptual experience, not just like, do you see something more quickly or not? And I've been thinking about this from a number of perspectives. And one of the perspectives is this experience of things as having objecthood, as being something with three-dimensional volumetric extension in space rather than an image. And of course, Magritte plays with this distinction in his ubiquitous The Treachery of Images. And one idea here is that we perceive something as being an object when our brain is not only predicting what the causes of the sensory signals are, but what would happen conditioned on how we interact with it. So this is bringing an active element to this sort of subjective experience. So perception isn't this passive process, just registering and interpreting sensory data. we're continually interacting with the causes of sensory signals in order to understand them better and control and manipulate them too. So we've been using VR and augmented reality to explore some of these ideas. And here what we can do in this is a very old video now, we can use augmented reality to develop fake objects that respond in different ways to our actions. And then we can ask questions about how we perceive these things when the brain has developed either sort of normal sensory motor expectations or when objects behave in ways that break normal sensory motor expectations. And again, this is sort of interesting to experience, but we can also do experiments. So this is Keisuke Suzuki's work. I won't go into the details, but it's often a challenge to translate these sorts of scenarios into rigorous experiments in the lab. That's probably what we spend a lot of time struggling with. In this case, it's a similar kind of design. We want to see, do people more quickly and accurately see objects that respond in predictable ways compared to objects that don't? And indeed, we do see a difference. It's very small, but it's reliable. Perhaps closer to Refik's wonderful machine hallucination work is something that's sort of been around in the neuroscience literature for a long time, which is this idea of, can we understand clinical and other sorts of hallucinations in terms of perceptual predictions, where our brain's top-down expectations overwhelm the sensory data in various ways? That's kind of one example there. Of course, we're all familiar with this. We can see faces in clouds. We can see faces in churches. The brain has faces are very salient stimuli, so it's a good example. We tend to see faces in all sorts of things. Of course, we know they're not real faces, but there's something face-ish about these sorts of images. And we can think of these at least as, okay, the brain is projecting face expectations into the sensory data. And so that really shapes our experience of it. It's not just a labeling, it's deep there in our perceptual experience of what it is. And I think the fact that it's deeply ingrained and not just a conceptual reminder that I think is key to bear in mind. The sort of, I don't know, this is a very long term that I've started to use and I worry about. It's just too long to describe this kind of work, which is try to understand use computational modeling to try to understand the neural basis of how perceptual experience appears, the phenomenology of experience, not just its function and so on, but how it appears in our conscious lives. And so we've indeed been using a lot of the same algorithms that Refik has talked about. In fact, one of the things is because neuroscience goes really slow, we tend to be significantly behind the curve. So this is still, I've been talking about this for a while. This is the old AlexNet network that Google with Blaise Pascal Aguirre and so on used for this deep dream algorithm, which is basically running an image classification network backwards so that you project, you select like a top level about basically saying, okay, there's a dog, and then you instead of updating the network's best guess, you update the image until that is whatever you set is satisfied. So you're projecting the expectation of dog onto an image now. And we did quite a few years ago now, this thing we call hallucination machine, where we adapted the deep dream algorithm to a panoramic movie from the campus of Sussex University. And so every frame was processed this way. Then people would experience the panoramic movie through a headset so they could look around and sort of visually explore the environment. And you can see that it's rather psychedelic. It's not just weird, it's specifically weird. And I think that's one way to understand my research program is to figure out in which ways things are specifically rather than generically weird. And so there are dogs sort of organically coming out of all parts of this scene. So it's a simulation of a psychedelic experience. What's interesting is that by parameterizing the network in different ways, you can simulate different kinds of perceptual phenomenology. This is a sort of more low-level, bit more geometric kind of hallucination. And what we're doing now, and I just rushed through it, is we're using now sorts of generative adversarial networks. These are kind of coupled dynamic generative networks and discriminative networks. Not strictly a GAN framework, but well, it depends anyway. But basically, half of it is like the deep dream network you just saw, and the other half of the network acts to try and constrain images to be drawn from the same category that the input image is from. So it's imposing some criterion of continuing realism to the image. And by messing around with this network in different ways, what we're trying to do is get a handle on the computational basis of different kinds of hallucinations. So complex visual hallucinations that people often report in conditions like Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia. Other kinds of complex and simple hallucinations that are associated with visual loss. You get this in things like Charles Bonnet syndrome. Complex means, you see objects and scenes and things happening. Simple is more geometric. And of course, we can try and understand when these, what are the computational underlying solutions, psychedelic, simple and complex, and so on. So the take home from that is, hallucination is an uncontrolled perception where predictions are very running riot. Then perception in the here and now is a controlled hallucination. Now, I just want to take just a couple more minutes to tell you, I'll just go on a little bit longer, really. This reminded me for some years now of some old concepts from art history, which I hadn't expected to encounter in this context. The beholder's share, going back to Ernst Gombrich, where he says things like it's the power of expectation rather than the power of conceptual knowledge that molds what we see in life no less than in art. It's already understanding our response to both art and our everyday experience as built on the expectations that the brain brings to bear. So there's no innocent eye. One cannot perceive what one cannot classify. So this again highlights the sort of the chimera of trying to think of perception as ultimately in the business of finding out what's actually there. You cannot find out actually what's there. Everything is an interpretation. He uses the example of impressionism, which I think is wonderful. In a sense, the impressionists are reverse engineering the visual system. They are understanding how it works in order to paint the sources of our perceptual experience rather than the outcome of the perceptual process, which I think is a wonderful example of sort of science by other means. In the lab, just to tell you a couple of things we've been doing more recently, which have an architectural component, actually. We've started to look at the strange phenomenon of strobe-induced hallucinations. This is a very old cultural phenomenon in the 1960s. This artist, Brian Geisen, was using these cardboard cutouts on record decks to sort of generate a kind of do-it-yourself strobe light. And people would have all kinds of interesting visual experiences and hallucinations when they stare at these. This William Burroughs, this is like having a look there. Now, these days we can use very high-powered LED stroboscopes that are very controllable, and we can measure EEG and turn it into something where we can figure out, okay, what's going on in the brain in these sorts of situations. And we've been doing this for a little while. What is remarkable is that I've tried this myself a number of times. Everybody has strong visual hallucinations in this. It varies from person to person, but it works pretty much for everyone. You have your eyes closed, and if you use the strobe at around the alpha rhythm, 10 hertz, which is around the natural oscillatory frequency of the visual cortex, you will see things like saturated color fields with geometric patterns changing in all sorts of interesting ways. So for me, this is a fantastic alternative window. We're always trying to think, how can we understand the brain basis of experience specifically? And by decoupling experience from its sensory causes, these are always useful ways to get at that question. We're trying to scale this up now, so we can, working with, and this is where the architecture thing comes in, working with groups including Jennifer Crook and the spatial designers Assemble in London, to figure out how we can build versions of this where we can apply it to groups of maybe 10 or even 100 people simultaneously, so we can have this kind of shared, individual but shared collective hallucination that we can guide people through. And the space in which these kinds of things happen is extremely important in the experience that people have and the journey they go on. So this is a very exciting new project for us. We're also thinking about how people report their experiences, and it's very difficult to just verbally describe what happens. So we're beginning to work with a couple of students at Sussex now to develop basically things like, this is called the Cluvinator, because it's sort of a way of mixing basic forms, these so-called Kluver forms of low-level perception, in different ways, so that people can actually tweak knobs to report what they experience. Think of it a bit like doing a caricature in police. You're trying to describe who you see, and you have someone drawing what you describe to get close. And so we were trying to automate that process in some way. Okay, going to finish in 2 minutes. And because what I don't want to miss out is the important thing that this applies also to the self. And when we talk about subjective experience, it's too easy to always fall into this idea that the self is the thing that does the perceiving, but the self itself is a perception. It is, the self, the body, is not the recipient of all this perceptual inference. The world and the self are jointly perceived by these unconscious brain mechanisms of best guessing. And we can't understand any subjective experience in full unless we understand the role the self is playing, both in selecting sensory data, but also every perceptual experience of the world is also a perceptual experience of the self. And the same principles apply. And so we think of experiences of, for instance, what in the world is my body is also a kind of perceptual best guess. This is famously illustrated in this demonstration of the rubber hand illusion, where a fake hand is somehow experienced as part of the body, even though it's not, and it's obviously not. The idea here being that there's enough sensory information for the brain to adjust its best guess that the fake hand is somehow part of the body. But there's a very interesting twist to this that we've been working on the last year or two, which is that it's hugely variable among people. So we did the rubber hand illusion on 450 students pre-pandemic. And we also measured how hypnotically suggestible they were. And hypnosis is a real thing. It's not just stage trickery and it's got weird baggage, but it's a real thing. People vary in their suggestibility. And it turns out that people who are highly trait suggestible experience the rubber hand illusion much more strongly. And you can understand that because the whole setup of the rubber hand illusion is like an implicit suggestion about what to expect. And a line of work we're really thinking about now is that this is going to apply to all sorts of perceptual experience. So there's a big implication of individual difference here. People are going to experience the same environment very differently if it's the kind of environment that encourages you to experience it in a particular way. It's going to massively depend on how suggestible you happen to be. So we need to bear that in mind too. I think that these strong trait differences will shape people's inner responses to the very same environment in predictable ways, ways we can measure and understand in advance what that's likely to happen. Finally, just a little thing we're still working on in VR is called substitutional reality. And here the idea is that we experience the world usually as being real. It seems obvious to say, but we take the content of our perception as really existing, right? Normally, unless we are having certain kinds of hallucination. Even though in some hallucinations, Charles Bonnet, we don't experience things as being real, but in, let's say, psychotic hallucinations, we do. How do we understand this difference? Well, we're beginning to explore that with a kind of VR. Yeah, it's me again. So I'll just let this run for a second. Any glitches? Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'll come back for one last time and hope everything is going right. Rather than let that, I'll just explain what's going on there. So what we're doing here is we're taking another panoramic video, but we're alternating it with live feed. So somebody's actually in this environment. They experience the environment, but then we occasionally chop to a pre-recorded video from exactly the same place. So what happens here is people don't realize that what they're experiencing is not real. So they have a complete conviction of perceptual reality, which is actually unfounded. And this way we can begin to manipulate the video and see under what circumstances this perception of reality is maintained and where it breaks down. So it gives us an experimental window into this very subtle but critical phenomenological dimension of what we take to be real itself. There are certain psychiatric conditions where you don't have dramatic hallucinations, but you experience things as somehow being unreal. These are derealization, dissociative symptoms, and things like Cotard syndrome in the limit. But really the message is it's predictions all the way down. Emotion is a kind of perceptual prediction. So our emotional responses to situations depend on the brain's predictions about the causes of signals coming from in the body, objecthood I've talked about. But even time, change, sense of reality, space, all these structural features of our perceptual experience. I think we should all think about all these too, not just as the canvas on which experience plays out, but as aspects of the brain's best guess itself. And with that, I'll finish there. Thank you, and sorry for going on for a little bit longer than I promised.
And I'll never apologize. Your work is fascinating. I could listen to you for hours. We've had a request from one of the audience who can't stay much longer to whether we can move Memo forward, which I think actually makes complete sense now, rather than having a discussion, because I think Memo's work goes kind of follows on immediately from that. And one of the real pleasures for me today is to be able to introduce Anil with Memo. I've had discussions about Anil with Memo and about Memo with Anil, and actually, I think for a while they were living in the same county in Sussex. Anyway, we're now meeting for the first time, so it's a great honor to be able to make that introduction. So what I'm going to do is going to Memo's going. I have a video which I'm going to show on my screen. And Memo's going to say a few words. I think maybe just we can invite Memo to say something now, and I'll put the screen up there, and then I'll play that and invite Memo to say something at the end. So Memo, over to you.
Well, yeah, thanks, Neil, and well, first, thanks to Rifik and Anil for the really inspiring presentations. And yeah, I used to live in Sussex. I used to live in the South Downs, but I'm not there anymore. So I've made a video because my internet's really weak and untrustable. So I've sent my video to Neil, who's offered to kindly play the video. And I'd like to thank Neil once again for inviting me amongst this very esteemed crowd. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we have afterwards. So after the video, I'm looking forward to the discussions that we have.
Okay, so let me share the screen. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Hi, my name's Memo Acton. I'm a computational artist, and my biggest inspiration is studying the nature of nature. This spans from the nuclear fusion in the heart of the sun to the photosynthesizing organisms that fuel all of life on the surface of the earth, to the incredibly complex hyperobject that we call human civilization and culture. I use computational approaches as a lens and language to abstract the behavior of these natural and anthropogenic processes to create data dramatizations. My research centers around expressive human-machine interaction and interventions that encourage meaningful human control, a term that I appropriate from the autonomous weapons literature. Framing technology as not external to us, but as extensions of our body, as extensions of our mind, I study its impact on us as individuals, on how we behave and how we express ourselves. And as cogs in a much larger machine, its broader impact on the complex networks that we form, on culture, and ultimately on our values, our laws, traditions, and rituals. As part of studying the nature of nature, I'm also very interested in studying the nature of the mind and how we make sense of the world. I am 70 trillion separate cells, more than half of which are not even human, and yet they all work together such that their interactions gives rise to the sensation that I have this one single unified body with a single unified sense of I, coordinated by the brain, an incredibly complex non-linear dynamical system in a constant state of oscillation, while its internal balance is continually perturbed. It's constantly seeking equilibrium, making predictions, and resulting in what we call perceiving, thinking, and feeling. The image that we see in our conscious mind is not a mirror image reflection of the outside world, but it is a reconstruction, a hallucination, based on our expectations and prior beliefs. So in my work, I create data dramatizations of natural and anthropogenic processes, and I explore state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms as a means to reflect on ourselves and how we make sense of the world. I know everyone hates Deep Dream, but I really love it. But it's not the aesthetics that I love, but the poetry of what's happening inside the algorithm. An artificial neural network has been trained to recognize objects in images, and now it's presented a new image that it doesn't recognize, such as my face. And what the Deep Dream algorithm does is, it runs the network backwards to generate new images, such that it amplifies certain neural activation patterns deep in the depths of the neural network. So this is analogous to you looking at a cloud and thinking that you see a rabbit, and then you draw the rabbit that you think you see, and then you look at the rabbit that you just drew, and then you draw again what you think you saw. So that in itself is interesting, metaphorically speaking. But I think this is far more interesting than that, because people look at these images and they say, oh look, it's a puppy slug or a bird lizard. But actually, there's no such thing as a puppy slug or a bird lizard. What we're seeing here is just noise with a particular distribution, such that when you look at it, you can't help but project what you know onto it. There are certain patterns in the original image which cause corresponding neurons in the artificial neural network to fire weakly, and then the Deep Dream algorithm amplifies those features in the original image. And then when we look at these images, activity in our brain registers those exact same features which were amplified by the Deep Dream algorithm, whether it be puppy-like or slug-like features. And we complete that recognition process by projecting those meanings back onto the image. This is like an entanglement. It's a duet of a quest for meaning making between an artificial and a biological neural network. And this is what a lot of my work around AI is exploring, using machines that learn to reflect on how we make sense of the world, and using machine bias to reflect on our own self-affirming cognitive biases. Because you can put this into an artificial neural network, pure random white noise, and it goes on a long journey through multiple dimensions and transformations in space and time, because quite literally that is what a deep neural network is, to produce this, a more structured noise with a more particular distribution. And we are machines that yearn structure. It's who we are and what we've always done. We look for patterns and we find them, and we project what we know onto them. We invent stories and we believe them. It's how we deal with uncertainty and how we connect with each other. We invent rituals, algorithms for the body and mind to transform our mental and emotional state to otherwise unattainable modes of being. We see things not as they are, but as we are. It depends on who we are, where we've been, and what we've done. Everything that you see or read or hear, even these sentences that I'm saying right now, you're trying to make sense of by relating to your own past experiences, filtered by your prior beliefs and knowledge. And actually, I have no idea what any of what I'm saying means to any of you. It's impossible for me to see the world through your eyes and feel what you feel without having read everything you've read, seen everything you've seen, and lived everything you've lived. Empathy and compassion is harder than we might think, and that makes it all the more valuable and crucial. This is from a series of work called Learning to See. It's an artificial neural network running real-time inference on live camera input. And there's a few themes behind this work. On a practical level, it's exploring expressive human-machine interaction, investigating deep learning to develop systems that augment human creative expression. Specifically, generative systems that we can use in a real-time, expressive manner with continuous, meaningful human control. As well as a number of videos, the work also exists as an installation. There's a plinth with a bunch of junk on it, some broken cables and dirty rags, and you can spend a few seconds playing with them for a quick bit of fun, or, if you're like me, you can spend hours meticulously crafting your perfect bouquet, or shaping your perfect waves or ocean scene. The models I trained are inspired by the 4 elements of nature. Flowers represent earth, the ocean is water of course, there's fire, clouds represent air or wind, and the 5th element, beyond our planet, the ether, the void, the cosmos, the home of God. This neural network is trained on thousands of images from the Hubble Space Telescope. But there are high-level motivations. This is a network which has seen nothing but thousands of images of waves or flowers. And now it looks upon the world and sees my desk and my hands, and it tries to make sense of what it's seeing in context of what it's seen before. But it can see only through the filter of what it already knows. Just like us, because we too see things not as they are, but as we are. We might be tempted to think that this network has learnt what distant space looks like. But of course, that's not entirely accurate. The Hubble Space Telescope doesn't give us these perfect snapshot photographs as objective visual representations of outer space. Rather, it streams data, numbers, and then those numbers are interpreted by us humans, by engineers, by scientists, even by artists, who stitch together patches and composite layers and even add colors. We don't know what distant space actually looks like. I don't even know if it's a valid question to ask if we can imagine what it looks like, if we can even fathom those kinds of scales, hundreds of thousands of light years in diameter. So this neural network isn't learning what space looks like, it's learning what we think space should look like, tainted with our assumptions, our biases, our romantic visions. And speaking of romantic visions, there is another motivation behind this particular work, because as I alluded to at the start of this presentation, I enjoy being reminded quite often that the atoms in my body, and in yours, and in fact everything that we see around us, were forged in the dying hearts of stars and supernova billions of years ago, billions of light years away, and was spewed across the galaxies before they came together for a very brief moment in time to become you and me. And as I quoted before, we are all connected. The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself.
This is a world of wonders.
Okay, fabulous. Yeah, Memo, would you like to add a few comments? I'm sorry, the volume dropped a little bit halfway through, but I hope you could hear it.
I actually lost connection and I dropped out a few times, but it sounded all right from what I could hear.
Yeah, do you want to add a few comments, Memo, or we can go on later on and
Well, so I think thematically, it's my approach to my interest in AI is very continues perfectly from Refik and Anil. In fact, I'm very inspired from a lot of research that Anil's been doing, and you might have even heard that in some of the language that I used, referring to reality as a hallucination. Also, the work of Andy Clark and Lisa Feldman Barrett and Carl Friston. So a lot of places where I draw inspiration from. But I mean, I am an artist, not a neuroscientist. Like, my work is very speculative. I'm not doing scientific research. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussions with everyone else.
Okay. What I would like to do then is it's going to and I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, try and make an architectural connection. I'm glad you mentioned Andy Clark, because I was thinking that when you were talking about the kind of extensions of the mind and so on. So let me just show. I'll try and keep it brief as possible, trying to make that connection into the world of architecture. Okay. So, well, first let me say that if you've been inspired by Anil, I've been inspired by you, Memo, and in fact, I've been inspired by both of you. And this was, I want to just kind of add a few reflections that don't really take it any further, but just kind of draw out what an architect makes of some of these debates. And the idea that somehow that reality is a kind of form of controlled hallucination, it really opens up all sorts of possibilities. And again, I'm glad that I read the bit of camouflage, but that is something that I think was the background of what I'm trying to work on now, coming at more from a psychoanalytic point of view. But nonetheless, I think there are sort of overlaps in terms of the approach. I just wanted to kind of like put this out there, which is something that I've changed my mind on since talking to Anil, because we mentioned this in the summer. This is Slavoj Žižek, who in one of my publications, Designing for a Digital World, he talks about the difference between reality and fantasy. And he says, actually, let's not see that as kind of the oppositional. Fantasy is constitutive of how we see reality. We see it through a lens of, as a Lacanian, he's coming at this from a certain perspective and saying that everything is filtered through the imagination, through the maze of the imagination, and don't accept that you're actually engaging with reality as such. Reality is out there, but it comes filtered. One of my thoughts that's come since then, I mean, I understand, but every time I mention psychoanalysis, Anil gets upset about it, so I'll keep quiet about that. But I will say one thing, is I think now, on reflection, this notion of fantasy is not quite as simple as that. It gives the impression we think about fantasy as being anything. You can fantasize about anything, but actually increasingly, I've been thinking that actually the way that we've been trained to see the world in a certain way, especially in schools of architecture, and therefore it's not so fantasy. In fact, actually, I would say on the contrary, we have a very constructed understanding of how we see the world. And in some ways, it's almost like a form of ideology. What Zizek calls the unknown knowns, the things that we know but we don't think we know, in other words, actually that is framing precisely how we see the world. So I don't think that fantasy is a very useful term here. I'd almost use something else that kind of refer to maybe even ideology itself. And let's not forget that science is a belief system too. Now, I don't want to mention the word religion, but there's something interesting here about the overlap between ideology, religion, and other forms of belief system. So this work by Memo, are more extraordinary. I saw this in the exhibition in the Barbican, and I've seen it as many times after. It's absolutely stunning work. And well, and just to quote Memo exactly what he's just been saying, that led to an exploration in my design studio at Florida International University, where we produced something similar. Okay, so I mean, just to kind of, this is something that I always talk about with my students. And if you were to ask any school kid around the world to draw a rainbow, they would draw a rainbow with 7 colors, different colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Everyone throughout the world somehow has been trained to sort of see the world in these terms. But we all know that actually a rainbow is not that at all. A rainbow is a whole spectrum of different colors, and yet we've been trained to identify the rainbow in that way. It always strikes me that in England, where we have so many different forms of cloud and rain, I was brought up in Sussex as well, so we've developed a whole language of differentiating the kinds of rain in the same way that Eskimos have developed a language of differentiating different forms of snow. And I read somewhere recently that apparently the color blue didn't actually appear in our lexicon until fairly recently. It wasn't recognized, but once you identify blue as blue, again, according to Anil's sort of comments, you begin to recognize blue everywhere. And we also have a kind of constructed notion of what we call functionalism in architecture. Ask any student of architecture what a functionalist building is, and they'll point to something like this: the Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier, something on pilotis, on these columns with a flat roof. Well, we all know that, especially those in Sussex, that actually a flat roof in England is not very functional. They leak. And yet we have this term functional, and people will tell you that this is a functional building. And from that, I kind of developed this kind of a theory, or at least a concept, which is a kind of boring and slightly ugly word, but I think a kind of interesting word: architecturalization. How we as architects see the world through a particular lens on which we've been trained. In other words, our gaze is not innocent. It's been trained, schooled in schools of architecture. In fact, and we, in a way, and I don't know how this fits in exactly, but the way in which we are inspired by the world around us and kind of architecturalize some of the images that we see. So this on the left-hand side is the early sketch by Jorn Utzon for the Sydney Opera House. His proposal for the Sydney Opera House, which was subsequently constructed in a very different way. When the engineers have finished with it, it had been rationalized in some way, but nonetheless, that was the original sketch, and it was inspired by the sails of yachts in the harbour in Sydney. Now, what does this mean? How are we as architects looking out at the world, absorbing that sort of world, and then generating work based on that? The idea first came to me when I was writing a counterpoint essay to the architectural design issue on the discrete, where I began to sort of pick up that actually the term discrete, which refers to computation, that the digital is discrete, had been kind of architecturalized into a language of architectural form. Equally, Mario Carpo, in his book, The Second Digital Turn, talks about what is the architecture of big data. And he reads that big data is messy. So maybe the architecture of big data is something like the chair on the right-hand side, a messy form of architecture. Now, that strikes me as being quintessentially an architectural sort of architecturalization. What is big data? How does it operate? How does it change the world? Well, it's through Uber. It's through processes, through informational processes that we see the world different, where we understand the world differently. And if you take an Uber, doesn't Uber look different to any other car? No. They look identical to other cars because they are the same. They are other cars. In other words, we're simply, the idea that somehow that big data should give us a different form of architecture seems to be missing the point. Actually, what it's giving us is a different way of processing the world and processing information. And this relates here to architectural concepts as well, or concepts that we see as architects. We look at, for example, at Gilles Deleuze's book, The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque, and immediately the fold starts generating kind of Maya or conjuring up in our mind Maya-generated curvilinear surfaces. We see the Baroque and we suddenly start thinking about the Baroque in terms of architectural Baroque and so on. I don't want to say negative about this, but this is Greg Lynn's. I know that he was instrumental in your background, had an influence on your background, Refik. And then, and famously, of course, there was this sort of diagram which architects immediately read as a building, as though it must be talking about a building. In fact, the fold was about ways of thinking. It was nothing to do with form as such. And yet, as architects, we take this and in a way that kind of, as once described by Harold Bloom, as a kind of creative misunderstanding. Architects are creative. They also, I wouldn't say misunderstand now, but any form of understanding is a form of misunderstanding, according to Lacan. We look at it through a certain kind of lens, and no more so than the work of Jacques Derrida. As soon as the word deconstruction appeared, architects looked at it and thought, oh, he's talking about construction. Well, no, he wasn't. He was looking at how it was an architectural metaphor. He was looking at how our understanding of the world is constructed in the same way as that rainbow is constructed in the mind of school kids. It's constructed, and the task of deconstruction is to dismantle that, to in a way get down to a solid foundation by removing all those distortions, all the kind of privileged hierarchies in Western metaphysics, to get down to a basis on which we can construct an argument. How do you escape those constructed ideas? Well, I don't think you ever can, but maybe the first step in the problem is to recognize it as a problem, and it then becomes a problem not by which you are trapped, but a problem with which you can deal. And then one final thought, and that is to say, Jeff Bennington, of course, famously was collaborating with Jacques Derrida, and he was at the University of Sussex, where Enel is now. Unfortunately, they closed down the French department, so Sussex lost one of its great thinkers. But I'm just wondering what kind of discussions could have been going on across campus in terms of the logic of AI, because what we're finding now is actually with AI, you get a kind of form of bias that's coming through. So there's a big debate about that in many ways is kind of reflects the constructed way in which we see the world. So I'm going to end that now and open up to the discussion. But I think there are enormous overlaps between everything that's been said this morning, and I want to just to open up to various forms of to various questions. Well, first of all, maybe I could ask Anil, because you've not seen the work of Memo before, but he's seen your work. What was your response to seeing Memo's? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I mean, it's brilliant. I have seen sort of bits and pieces Memo. I've followed your stuff a bit, but I've not seen that particular video and watched it. Basically, just agreeing with everything you said. It's put very beautifully, illustrated wonderfully, and asks exactly I think the wider kinds of questions that are raised by this way of thinking scientifically about and philosophically about perception. It's sort of it's a reflection onto ourselves, onto our relations, onto how we might have a consensus perception, but also how our perceptions might differ. And I've been thinking in terms of things like, we're very familiar now with ideas of things like social echo chambers, social media echo chambers, but we also have perceptual echo chambers as well. We seek out perceptually, we forage for the sensory information that we predict will be useful in some way. So, we're always self-reinforcing our individual perceptual worlds. But yeah, I thought it was wonderful, and I love the way you described the appeal of Deep Dream, and thought that was great. It's a real, not just the aesthetics. Yes, I mean, I get a bit embarrassed by playing that old Deep Dream video now after sort of 5 years, but it still is beautiful to me too, because of what it reveals under the hood, and now there's such a kind of panoply of alternative algorithms that we can use as sort of both metaphor, at varying levels of abstraction, as sort of rigorous computational models of the neurobiological processes of perception, to something much more metaphorical. One of the things that I'm sort of trying to work with is, because a lot of these algorithms, they're not designed for that purpose, right? They're designed for some other more strictly technological purpose or industrial purpose. And so we in neuroscience tend to work with algorithms sort of drawn off the shelf, and I'm sure probably you do this as well in artist capacity, work with what's already there. But I'm fascinated by the idea, what can we do if we develop these algorithms specifically for this purpose of shedding light on perception? And so, with some students, we're working now on, actually in some collaborations with people like Bengio and Yoshua Bengio in Canada, who these deep learning pioneers, can we develop architectures that the purpose of which is to do this practice of computational phenomenology? And so, for instance, we're working on something now called hybrid predictive coding, which is where instead of predictions just flowing top down and errors bottom up, both predictions and prediction errors flow in both directions. And because there's a sense in which predictions can be instantiated in a very early phase of response to sensory information. And phenomenologically, the idea is this might correspond to something like gist. So we tend to open our eyes, we have an immediate perceptual impression of the overall meaning of a scene. And then we fill in the details very quickly, but in brain time, certainly there's a distinct temporal component to how we move from gist to detail. And so we certainly know from our own experience, there's a very different phenomenological character to these two ways of experiencing gist and detail. And so that's something we're going to work on. But no, Memo, I thought it's absolutely fantastic. I only wish we'd sort of made contact while you were still living in the South Downs. That would have been brilliant.
Can I just throw one thing out at you while I've got this incredible array of minds in front of me? My speculation, and I'm probably wrong because I'm just a naive architect and things, but what I find interesting is if you're reversing the flow of the neural network with deep dreams. So instead of interpreting the world, you're generating the world. Now, I've always entertained the possibility that somehow the computational world might begin to kind of give us some clue as to how we ourselves think. And I was always inspired by Craig Reynolds and his Boids, where he was, and we found out how birds operate because Craig had to develop some rules for bird behavior. Now, my thinking is this, and I just want to bounce this off you, whether if they're going in the opposite direction, does that imply that the process of interpretation, of criticism, of kind of theoretical reflection, shall we say, is the opposite of creativity or generativeness? In other words, because what we find, interestingly, in architectural culture, and I'm sure possibly also in the world of art, is that those who are most creative tend not to be very theoretical, and those who are most theoretical tend not to be not very, very creative. It's kind of you don't get many people straddling both. You do get a few, Peter Eisenman maybe being one of them, but on the whole, they're opposite. Would that be?
It strikes me what you've described there is perfectly captured by the architecture of a generative adversarial network. So you have the creative people trying to fool the critics into like thinking that it's really good, and then you have the critics always trying to learn to distinguish between what's good and bad, and that's exactly the dynamic that happens in a GAN. So not in the sort of deep dream architecture specifically, but in those more recent versions where you have these coupled discriminatory and generative networks. But I think that's quite, I don't know how literally to take it, but the analogy holds at least at some level.
Yeah, no, I think because as a theorist, I mean, it's those people who are most creative. I'm thinking here of Raina Banham or indeed Sanford Quinter, who's here today, are the ones who are most interesting. But yes.
Sorry, Neil, by the way, for architecture context, I think it's a very, very brilliant moment. Maybe, I don't know, I never heard his name, but for me, when I was back in like undergrad years, the very first person that really opened my mind in architecture is Usman Haq. And his Dressing the Shadows of Architecture was an incredible piece of writing. And in this writing, he was saying actually maybe what we are discussing 2005. And he was saying, if architecture is a combination of hardware, such as solid static walls, roofs, and floors, and software, ephemeral sounds, smells, temperatures, and atomic mining waves, then perhaps the most productive conception of an architect is as an operating system designer. I mean, 16 years ago, reading this material, for me, I mean, of course, now we are combining neuroscience, AI, and philosophy, and science, and so many things. But I mean, his predictions and his speculations were incredible for me, at least, which we never heard his name, but I think Usman Haq is really criticize his world in a, I don't know, it was really very brilliant to see that vision and what we are right now doing all together is really interesting, Bridge.
Oh, we've heard his name, but yeah, Matthias, can I, would you like to ask a question? You're muted.
Yes, of course. What?
No, it's okay. Okay now.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the amazing presentations. Refik, we've met. Hello, nice to see you again. Memo, we've never met. I hope we meet soon someday. It's really awesome work. And especially, my question is actually to Anil, and I thought this was a super thought-provoking presentation, super inspiring. You talk about computational phenomenology, and I have a quick question about like the larger framework of that idea, because on the one side, what you describe in the way how the mind works and how we perceive reality seems like an idealist position of philosophy. So that basically there is no reality, there is no physicality. We only imagine or hallucinate this. Yeah. Or is it rather something like materialist realism position where we actually go to everything is a material process, including the processes of our mind, which are based on chemistry and electricity. So, and I would like to know, like, where is this idea going?
You want to pigeonhole me in metaphysics. This is fine. I mean, I tend to I deliberately almost avoid these things because in the end, I think it doesn't matter that much. It's a bit like my sort of thinking about consciousness generally. So I'm quite agnostic about how consciousness as a phenomenon happens to be or can be understood as part of the physical universe. But to answer your question, I think my most comfortable position, and I think everything I say is compatible with materialism. I think that's the most pragmatic thing to do. So when I say that, along with many others, that the way in which we experience the world is always a construction, this is not synonymous with idealism, with saying that nothing is out there. It's my philosophical touchstone for this stuff is Kant. Is that there is stuff out there, the noumenon, but we can never have direct access to what it is. So everything that we experience and even measure scientifically is always indirect, always an indirect reflection. So Locke, I think, made it. Philosophers argue about it, but it's still a useful distinction, right? So there are some things which are called primary qualities, like solidity and volume and so on. I mean, these things are observer independent. They exist no matter what brains are doing in response to them. So it's always a bad idea to go and jump in front of a moving bus. However it appears to you in your perception, it will hurt. However, the busness of the bus, the color of it, and that's a construction. That's a sort of a secondary quality, as Locke would say. And so things exist, but the way things appear in our experience is always a construction.
Thank you. That helped a lot. Thanks.
But just to say, I might be wrong about it. I mean, who knows what ultimately what the nature of reality is? In fact, very little to me turns on the answer to that question.
But I think that you mentioned in between the idea of speculation, and I think also Neil mentioned the nature of speculation in architecture. I mean, there's like the idea to speculate about how we perceive reality is in itself already, I think, a very interesting process that helps us as architects to understand what we do also better. Yeah, so it's apart from the really inspiring, let's say, morphological quality of things that happen through the work with neural networks. And I mean, we saw beautifully aesthetic work from Refik and from Memo. In architecture, we're experiencing something similar. And on top of it, because architecture has this massive amount of information at hand, we can actually really, dig through this data to hopefully create architecture that responds to current needs or current. They can be cultural or technical, by the way. They can be cultural or just practical. But both of those are really interesting thoughts. And maybe just as a follow-up thought, because one of the things that I've been discussing with my fellow colleagues is whether it is a viable route that, because I mean, one of my arguments is that we as a discipline have about 3,000 years of a history in terms of design. Like we have tons and tons of designs at disposal, right? Which means we also have like an enormous repository of data that we can actually dig into in order to generatively come up with contemporary architectural solutions. Now, there's always vagueness in that, like what is contemporary, what is a viable solution, and so on. So there's like a lot of things that are unclear at the moment in what we're doing, but that's exactly what makes it interesting. And to Neil's point about the misreading of architects of other content, which I think is a super interesting topic in itself, that's something in regards of neural networks. That's a question for you, where I'm sort of trying to understand what the point is, in that what humans can do extremely well is, for example, read in a mistake a viable opportunity, like advantage through reading a mistake. And it seems to me that neural networks at the moment are not able to understand that or to emulate that weird cross, this kind of cross connections in our brain that result in new information or new ideas.
So I think Refik and Memo would have a lot to say about the relevance of these things for the practice of architecture. But I think you hit on a useful point. I'll keep it very short. About one of the things that most neural networks these days are not particularly good at, although this is becoming a thing, is what we might call metacognition. So, the ability that we have and other animals have to kind of have confidence or lack of confidence, to be able to judge the accuracy or reliability of inferences. And when we make a perceptual decision, we immediately, you can also have a feeling of how likely that is to be the case. And this is an extremely useful thing to do for systems that behave in the real world. We need to judge the likelihood of being right and learn, in a sense, use our own internal confidence judgments as a sort of internal feedback to train ourselves to do better. And neural networks at the moment are not, beginning to have things like metacognitive processes that sort of observe their own behavior and learn from it, but that's not widely done yet. I'll just leave it there and let others chip in.
I have a question, maybe to everyone actually. Can we say architecting perception is the word that sounds weird? I mean, English is not my mother language. Maybe when I say this kind of things, don't want to be like a pseudo science moment, but because I think we are, since the beginning of this beautiful ideas and questions and speculations, looks like there's another architecting attempt. So, in that context, I'm just, architecting the, mind or a space or an experience or a feeling or a research. I feel like here the inspiration is architecture actually, which I felt in this morning at least. But maybe the wording is weird, but I felt something.
Refik, that's exactly what I was thinking when you used that term in the summer, architecting. Exactly. No, I think so. I would certainly think that there is what I got from discussion with Memo a while back was this idea that we look at the world through a lens, and there are different lenses and we see different things. So I think, but there's architecting, there's also media arting, and there's probably also a kind of neurosciencing and so on. I'd just like to welcome Sophia Crespo here. And we have Philip Yuan here also, and Sanford Quinta, and Benaz Farahi. And so please, please follow up with some questions. And also Maria Kupsova in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to jump in. First of all, thank you so much for your talks. It's just mind-blowing, your work. And Refik, Memo, Anil, it's a great pleasure to meet you. I think we are all learning from you a lot. And now it's great to be just in a common discussion and being able to chat, not to listen to you in the closed conference. So thank you, Neil, for inviting me. I don't know, I am doing a lot of work and maybe processing a lot of similar thoughts as you're expressing in your work, in my personal projects and within the academy in Austria and in Russia, also collecting different experience in different parts of the world. And I don't know, probably we all looking to some kind of intelligence and cognition, and trying to understand also ourselves. And I like to every time refer to the work of Gregory Bateson, I think you all know his work, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And when he's describing our mind and our intelligence and cognition as something shared and distributed within the environment, within the ecology, within the geology, and of course here we can say also within the machines, within the algorithms. So, and when we are looking ourselves and our cognition and our mind within this distributed network, I think we are stopping to be human-centric. And this, if we're talking about the perception, no, this perception is not related anymore to the perception of human, but to the perception of any species in the world, no, to maybe a perception of a machine, a perception of a planet, a perception of an insect, I don't know, of a robot, or I don't know, you can think of whom. But here, I think this, for example, if we look into the, I don't know, geological intelligence or natural intelligence, these types of minds are not working with the visuals mainly, they're working with the different types of perception, more exchange of the particles, exchange of the smells, temperatures, and any other, I don't know, perceptions that we can just imagine, that we usually don't program with the guns, because we usually work in a computation, we a bit maybe stuck with visual perceptions now, and we are working with visuals quite a lot. And I think this visual perception is very much related to us humans. And I think we're a bit tired ourselves as well in being in this screen media, especially this year, which just drives us crazy. At the same time, making this possibility to talk all together. But yeah, I think we all want to come back a bit to the analog. I like this word, carnal perceptions, something that we feel with our body, with our skin, with our, I don't know, with our carnality, And I think the same features are related to this distributed intelligence, to the geology. And I think that we need to think into the computation in this planetary scale. When we are starting to compute maybe really the planet, we are starting to compute not only our visual aesthetics, but our carnal aesthetics. And I think this is starting to be very much related to architectural questions. And we are starting to design the environment where we are and starting to think about ourselves as a part of this distributed system. And I don't know which question comes from this statement. I just wanted maybe to share my thoughts with you and ask you, what do you maybe think on that? And yeah.
Well, while people are thinking about the answer, we also have a question coming from Emmanuel Coe. Do you want to ask it, Emmanuel?
Hi, thanks, Neil. Thanks for the amazing presentation. In fact, I've been following Memo like even early, 2010, those amazing interactive stuff. Really love those. I have a specific question for Anil in the sense that you kept talking about perception. I'm wondering what about this idea of abstraction. So I'm kind of trying to link what Neil was talking about, essentially the architect's eye, right? The way in which we are trained to look at stuff. And talking about Peter Eisenman, I was also reminded that he wrote somewhere, he said something like, Tafuri couldn't see, Colin Rowe could see, but in a limited way. And it is the job of the architecture school to make the student able to see. So to him, it's a pedagogical thing. So in design or in art, some of the earliest things that we do is about, like for instance, you sketch and then you do abstraction, right? So there's this layer before perception somehow. We could draw the parallel with the neural networks where they somehow abstract in different layers, but then not sure if it's like the kind of a good parallel. Yeah, maybe you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think about. I mean, I think any discipline is training you to see in some way. And I'm aware that I'm already using the sort of over-reliance on the visual metaphor that Maria just pointed out we tend to do. And by the way, I completely agree. And there's this, you know, neuroscience too, there's often this sort of assumption that you know, people just reach for vision. We do it in my lab too. We just sort of do a lot of stuff with vision, partly because we're visual creatures, but you know, we're not only visual creatures, clearly. But vision is just a very convenient thing to study in the lab. So we typically end up, you know, looking for the car keys where under the light. It's what we can do. But we should always remember that that's what we're doing. So yeah, I mean, every discipline involves learning to see in some way. And here, actually, I think scientific training is probably less advanced than in, let's say, architecture or in art, because it's often sort of assumed that the scientific method is set and it works, and you know, you just read the papers and you do your experiment and you add to the body of scientific knowledge. But this is obviously extremely not the case. And you know, science is in a bit of or certain sciences are in a bit of a crisis of replicability, of trust, and I think a lot of this has to do with the practice of science not being part of the study, the training of scientists sufficiently. We don't reflect on, or we don't build into the training how the process itself is supposed to work. You know, it is, as I think, as Neil might have said, it's a belief system, or somebody said it's a belief. I think it's a unique belief system among belief systems, because ideally it is self-correcting, but it's not intrinsically self-correcting in the same way that, you know, democracy is kind of good, but it's still, it can't be taken for granted. You have to train people to make science to make science avail of its potential for self-correction. I'm going off on a tangent, I realize. To your point more specifically, I think the way I understand perception is not that it's not that extraction of things is irrelevant. It's more that that's by itself insufficient. So, you know, you look at these neural networks, they extract features at different levels of abstraction. That's what they do. And and there'll be some lowest level, there'll be some level at which it bottoms out. And you can decide what that level is. And if it's not a case of vision, it can be an abstract space. If your data are intrinsically more abstract. But perception involves not just extraction at different levels, but also a process of interpretation about what all those abstractions collectively mean. And I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I was thinking about the abstraction in the sense that if someone who is trained in modern architecture, for instance, looking at the same building, he would probably draw the edges, right? Because the surface is pretty much nothing. Whereas someone who was trained pre-modern would be quite different abstraction and therefore representation on 2D drawing, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very likely. And I think exposing those differences and realizing and recognizing that they're playing a part is important. You know, you need to know. It's about uncovering your biases or giving yourselves new biases as well. Biases is not always a bad thing.
I want to jump in here. First of all, thank you so much, three of you. This was really thought-provocative, very inspiring. Obviously, I know Memo and Refik, and it was really wonderful, Anil, to hear your talk. So my question actually is to echo some of the things that you just mentioned, Anil, regarding the bias, particularly also through the overlap of your work with Memo, and thinking about ways that in which we as human, we somehow project our own biases when we perceive the world and when we interpret information around ourselves. And these biases could come from our educational system, our family, our society, people around ourselves. And yet we start creating systems, artificial systems that they incorporate those biases within those systems, and yet kind of ripple out more or sort of aggregate more of those biases within those systems. Now, in the last year, what we are seeing in America, we are seeing like how astonishingly surprising these biases are. Like we are every day surprised that, wow, there is increased sort of harsh sexism and racism that systematically exist in this society. So in a way, my question is like, then when we are generating this type of artificial systems, how could we step out of this type of biases? Is there any way that we can even say that we can address unbiased systems?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd be super interested in Memo's comments on this as well. But I mean, the one thing that immediately comes to mind, I mean, this is a massive problem. You're absolutely right that there's these sort of self-entrenching dynamics that biases get built into the structures that then reinforce those biases. And what's really pernicious about it is when you don't realize that this is what's going on. You know, and I always think back to that, you know, remember that dress that was blue and black or white and gold, which is a terrific example, because the reason people found it so weird was because it was very, very, very difficult to appreciate there was another way of seeing it. And that's, of course, the problem that we have in broadly in society now. And it was fascinating that you could get an example of that chasm even in a very, very low level perceptual experience of a bad photo of a dress. So it's there. What do you do about it? And there's been increasing activity in the AI community, and I think a number of people here will know more about this than I do, about how to understand and respond to biases in algorithms. There's just so many examples of, let's say, face recognition algorithms that have been trained primarily on white people and therefore can't recognize a black face, which is just it's just insane. But these things have been deployed. These algorithms got to the stage without people realizing this is a problem until they get out there. So on the one hand, you can try to make sure data sets are representative and that so the algorithms that are trained for a particular purpose don't end up baking in obvious biases. But this is only part of the solution. It's because it will only deal with I think, as Neil said, it'll only deal with the known factors. You can only curate a data set for biases that you're aware that you want to mitigate against. And the danger is if you don't know what those biases are, then they're going to get baked in anyway. And so another response, actually, this is why the whole Deep Dream algorithm was designed, because it's trying to understand what representations a network is learning. If you don't, they're really hard to figure out. I mean, there's so many parameters, so many layers, that if let's say you're using one of these algorithms to decide whether someone's eligible for Social Security, it'll just give you a yes or no, and it just says no. Then you want to know, well, why did it say no? Why did it make that decision for that particular input? And it's very hard to know that for a neural network, because unlike sort of old style AI systems where the processes of reasoning are very explicit, there's some sort of just probabilistic weighting of connections. So Deep Dream was originally designed to help visualize why networks make the classifications they make. And so I think that branch of AI is very useful for its social deployment too. If we can understand to visualize what networks have actually learned, then we can detect biases that we might not have been aware of earlier on. But all of these are only partial solutions to what is a very, very large, deep problem.
Can I ask here a question, Anil? Don't you think it's also a question of maybe we have a misunderstanding of how learning happens? Because I think the way that networks learn is quite different than how we as humans learn. Because if you look also at there is strong biases also when it comes to different cultures, how they are represented in AI, because many cultures, they didn't have the technology to document in a way their culture, while other cultures, they had the technology available. So suddenly you have oversampling in a way on one side. So right now the networks, yeah, you're just crunching like huge data sets and you're just learning that way. But we as humans, we don't learn that way. So is that also a question of probably the problem here is also the learning way, not only just the data set itself?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic. It's good to see you again, by the way. I haven't seen you since the summer. Yes, the short answer is yeah. I mean, so the way in which most of these networks that we play with have been trained, and of course, this is I think something you know, Refik and Memo and people have been playing with, the availability of these massive data sets. But this is absolutely not how humans learn. You know, we don't sort of passively crunch huge samples of data. The first obvious thing is we actively select the data that we learn from. You know, we forage for and how do we do that? You know, how does the brain predict what is the relevant data and how to obtain it? And this is another way in which biases get built in. You know, we might learn data, we might sample data to confirm the predictions that we're already making, the classifications that we already bake in. So you know, there are new forms of algorithms that, I mean, we've been working on a bit as well of using things like active inference. You mentioned Memo, you mentioned Kalfrist, and so you know we've been using generalizations of free energy minimization to sort of you can think of like a perceptual inference as minimizing your prediction error in the moment about what's happening, but you can think of learning in a way as minimizing your longer term prediction error over the set of data that you expect to encounter in the future. You know, formally that's you then update the parameters of a generative model rather than just the inference that you're making at the point. But they can both be articulated in the same minimization of prediction error thing. And if you allow a network to choose its own data, then you can start learning in different ways. But yeah, I completely agree. And of course, you know, humans are capable of learning one shot too. In many times, it's something happens, a good thing or a bad thing. We don't need it to happen 6 million times from slightly different orientations in order to learn it. The first time you see an ostrich, you know it's an ostrich. So there are still many fascinating differences between biological learning and machine learning.
Hi.
I'd like to add. Sorry, go on. Go ahead.
All right. I just want to add something. Yeah. Because thank you so much. It's a really wonderful lecture. I really want to ask is I somehow think from your presentation, it's like people recognize things based on what they have already known, and when they face something they're unknown, they may think those things are new. But new is also has some certain of a bias in between here. Because for some people it's new, some people might not. And for the entire human race or whatsoever, it calls creativity. And what architects do or designers do is we create something based on something people know or unknown. So I'm wondering if that AI can help this in some sense. Is it possible that the AI could help us to somehow organize the unknown and also represent something people may already know? So it's something like you guys already show in the videos that in Memo's video. It's like something, yeah, in between the reality and the virtual, and some in very small particle it's similar, and when it's in larger image, people are recognize things based on their recognition. So I just wondering, is that the AI when it dealing with the data set and translate something to something we know or unknown, is it possible to, I don't know, is there any kind of a measure to translate, and that could help architects to do the unknown, to do the creativity? Yeah, I understand my question might need a bit fuzzy. Yeah, please. I don't really get the sentence in really good. Yeah, please.
No, it's very clear. The question is very clear, and it's a very good question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot. There are theories around like how if something is too novel, we can't appreciate it. If it's too unexpected and too unrelatable, we can't appreciate it. If it's too similar to what we know, then we still don't appreciate it. But there's a sweet spot. In fact, it's called the Wundt curve. That kind of goes up like this, and then it goes down. And really, you want to be at that peak. And I know, like researchers in computational creativity are basically trying to design agents that optimize for the peak of the Wundt curve. I don't think that it's at a stage where it can be deployed in a real design practice, but I am convinced that there is an information theoretic approach to finding or somehow quantifying how creative something is. Because also, as you mentioned, like creativity, the concept of creativity is subjective. I might find something to be very novel, but it might not be very novel to you. A classic example given by Margaret Bowden is like Einstein was very creative in coming up. Also played the violin, but his violin playing wasn't a major contribution to humanity, but he might have considered himself as very creative within his own mind. So these are some of the factors that need to be taken into consideration. Right. And there is research in this. I do think it will be a thing in the future, but it's very, very early research at this stage.
There are two questions that are coming.
I'm sorry, can I just add one more, Neil? Sorry, because I'm super interested in this part. Because I'm interested to the experiment you made that when people look at a real space and later when you shift to the virtual space, people cannot really tell. And can this happen in the architectural design? I mean, how?
Oh, that one's for Anil, I guess.
I'm not. I think you're a bit out of my wheelhouse for that. I think Memo, covered this idea very, very nicely.
But I mean, regarding your VR piece, where the people where the audience couldn't tell if they were in the real world or not. I think it was regarding that project, the question.
Sorry, can you can you repeat then the question?
Yeah, we lost you at Memo. Could you just repeat your question?
Oh no, I didn't have a question. I was saying I think one use question was about specifically that VR project. It was my understanding.
Yes, I was asking that. I mean, in that way, it's somehow you can control people's recognition of something. So meaning we design space is very similar, we merge something people know and something people unknown, the space or function, material, whatsoever, mix those things together and make people think, okay, I know this space, or I know this is a toilet, this is a auditorium room, etc. So I'm wondering how you mix these things together.
I mean, So the VR thing that I was showing wasn't really about that. It was more about not recognizing something as new, but recognizing something as real versus not real. But I think you're absolutely right.
True.
There's a lot of stuff in sort of thinking about creativity that thinks about combinatorial creativity, that it's putting together existing elements in new ways. But then this, of course, raises exactly these whole host of questions about where is the creativity in that process? Is it in the recognition, or is it in the combination of the things? And it's very hard to separate that out. So Memo mentioned Maggie Bowden, who's also at Sussex, by the way, which is like a good thing too. And she's written sort of hugely influential stuff on computational creativity and asking the question, you know, can computers be creative, which is so hard to separate, you know, because it's a judgment. You know, it's not a thing that it inheres in any system itself. But exactly how to find that balance that Memo talked about as well between the familiar and the novel, you know, that's a challenge for every discipline. Right. That's also a challenge for, you know, the next scientific experiment I try to design. We always put together existing pieces in new ways.
Yeah.
There's I've got two questions lined up from I want to just give them a chance to have a platform. One from Maria and one from Marina. I should say Maria, it's great that she's just one of the master's students, but she was the one responsible for that GAN in the very beginning of the Grand Canyon. Maria. Okay.
I thank you for inviting me on. I just have to say I'm starstruck. And Anil and Refik, I've been studying your work for these past few months. And one thing I took from Refik was light as a material. And that's when I started looking at the Grand Canyon. And you have all these patterns. You have light streaming in different colors throughout the day because of the sun positions. And then I started thinking, okay, well, without we perceive the world thanks to light. Without light, we can't see, we don't perceive anything. So as humans, we perceive colors due to the photoreceptors in our eyes that process and piece together colors. And then I started thinking about people who are colorblind. So people who have color vision deficiency have a reduced ability to distinguish between certain colors, and few have complete absence, so just black and white. So that makes me think, does that mean that the world is really black and white, and that we're just perceiving and placing colors, and that those who have CVD see the world as it really is, especially those with complete absence, as black and white? Are we painting our world? Is the world really black and white? Is this one of those paintings where you have numbers and you color them in? So thank you.
By the way, I would like to say, so I think what was really inspiring all today is we are talking incredible ideations and concepts, but I think the material that can hold all these ideas, unfortunately not a concrete glass or steel, right? Even not like a dynamic 3D printing options will barely can hold these ideas. We are talking things in flux, things constantly changing and in reaction to certain things, right? So I think fundamentally here, all these brilliant ways of questioning or deep diving into the ways of whys and hows will eventually need a material. I do not think these ideas can survive in the form of architecture in a physical reality, which is, I think, where the things get more challenging, right? Because AR/VR is like a comfort zone for ideas that can always be amazing to perceive. But from my question to architects, actually, how will you trying to make this world available to humanity once the ideas are infinite?
Yeah, can I continue here based on this idea, and probably also Refik, Anil, and also Memo, you can address this. And by the way, a great presentation. Hi, Anil, I forgot to say hi. And also Refik, it's great to see you again. Memo, yeah, I think it's the first time when we meet. So nice meeting you, and really nice seeing your work. So what I'm thinking of is similar with what also Refik is saying, it's how exactly we are going to impact as architects. And I'm also thinking at this idea of creativity in architecture, because right now, mostly we are talking about perception. So this is about, like Refik is saying, it's about architecting perception. This is about, in a way, using AI as a way to understand our own way of perceiving things. Or as architects, we are going to use AI in a way to augment perhaps our creativity or something. Yeah. So if we think about it in Asian cultures, they didn't have this kind of concept of creativity back then. Yeah. So they were mostly thinking or viewing creativity almost as a sort of form of discovery. Yeah, that was the way that they looked at creativity. And then later in the 18th centuries, they started to these kind of mentions of creativity became more frequent, and the concept of imagination started to creep in a way. So then only later in 19th century, we started to actually think of creativity as a sort of, or to reflect on creative processes, let's say. And for me, what I'm getting with here is that, we are using this kind of AIs, and we are asking AIs to look at buildings and then to output something. And it's always, you look at Alan Turing test and to see, in a way, is the machine intelligent or not? But then we have also the philosophical question of the Chinese room. And what's happening most of the time for us is like, I have a feeling that us as architects, we are like mostly ourselves inspired by the results of machine, but it's not that the machine necessarily is intelligent, yeah? Because I don't think we are looking in a way for overfitting issues when it comes to creativity, for example. And what will happen there if the machine is just memorizing things? Can we really say that the machine is really creative then? Because it's not really creative. And then if it's not creative, then why do we need an AI? You can just take a bunch of images, put them into a blender, spin the blender, and you're going to get something new in a way. So it's not really creativity then. Or the machine at least is not really creating something new. And then also probably some of you are also familiar with Demis Hassabis types of creativity. He's identifying a few types of creativity like interpolation, extrapolation, and pure like novelty in a way, or something completely new. And interpolation, I think it's mostly the networks that we have these days. They pretty much do just interpolations, yeah. Like SileGANs, for example, they are very good at interpolations. So you have domain, you have a sort of design space that you define by examples that you fit in the data set. And then you just have this kind of averages maybe of some of those points in the data set, yeah. And then you consider that average as being something creative, yeah. But that's within that confined, like, data set that you present, yeah. And then you have extrapolation that it's able, in a way, to go outside. And maybe you have networks that are able to imagine similar with query networks, yeah. So here for me, I'll just put in a way the discussion for the three of you, like, how do you see in a way this kind of idea of creativity and the way that we are using actually the networks? Because personally, I don't have a feeling that we are actually very aware of that. I think we are using right now networks almost like in ancient times when we were just using them as a form of discovery, but not as something that is truly creative or intelligent.
Daniel, I definitely agree with your last comment, because I think, of course, it's an evolution of many accessibility to hardware and software and so on. But I think when I think about fine-tuning a model, right, in certain cases when you have certain data sets that is frozen, unfortunately, as an unfortunate frozen reality of things, right? Unless you fine-tune it, or unless like Memo's speculation, like transferring the knowledge to something existing in other knowledge. But I think in architecture, what is really exciting is when you have a certain, imagination, right? A space in a function and structure. When you think about, like, say, like some historic buildings, right? They are there. Like they are representing an idea, a moment in time, a speculation, a culture, a country, and so on, right? A religion and many things. But I think what is really interesting here, if we are thinking about neural networks, or at least mimicking minds of humans and so on, and I think architecture has to deconstruct itself, right, from the material entities. I don't think there's any near future of imagining anything soon with the ideas that we are discussing right now, which I heavily agree with you, Daniel. And navigating in latent space is one thing to know for sure, but how to translate something you can't even perceive to like a three-dimensional bias world is another big problem. And even though, let's say, there's incredible policies like DeepMind is exploring every single day, right? Like from protein folding to many other genius worlds of like seeking, unknown in the mind of machine. Even though like these policy systems or different ways of interacting with models, I think they are so in flux that architecture has this time problem, I guess. So how to solve also time problem is another, I think, a great challenge in physics, right? Or other materials. So I think there's these two incredible problems at the same time will be most likely stressing architectural imagination.
I just wanted.
Go ahead.
Just very quick, I wanted to get back very quickly to Maria's question about color, just because I think it's very important. And the question was indeed, you know, so do we sort of paint colors onto the world, and is black and white the way it really is? Well, yes and no. So black and white is, we do project colors onto the world, but black and white, black is also a color and white is also a color. So it's not that black and white is the objective reality. There are no colors out there at all. Every color is an interpretation, even black and white. And of course, the difference between color blindness and achromatopsia is very interesting. Yes, if you lack one of the three photoreceptors in your eyes, you won't be able to distinguish typically reds from greens. But that's something that's happening at the level of the retina then. But if you have damage to the cortical area, like V4 or something like that, then the world is drained of all color. And Oliver Sacks writes sort of beautifully about some cases of this. It's a very different thing, but color is always an interaction. I think Cézanne had this lovely quote, which is, you know, color is the place where the brain and the universe meet.
Can I just, there were a couple of, thank you, Anil, and thank you, Maria. That was a beautiful question. There's Marina wants to ask a question, and Alexa, and I mean, I know that Sophia Crespo's around here with us as well. Philip Beasley, also Philip Yuan, and Sanford Quinter. But let's go ahead with Marina first of all, followed by Alexa, and others to follow.
Yes, hello everyone. This is incredible. It's an incredible opportunity to have all these incredible minds and designers together. And yeah, my question is, it's related with Daniel's question in a way, but also with Benaz's point, and about this side and counter side of artificial intelligence. And I want to mention that the lesson what Terry said, that art, science, and philosophy require like cast planes over the chaos. And they say specifically, these three disciplines are not like religions that invoke dynasties or gods. They are epiphany of a single god in order to paint firmament on the umbrella, like the figures in an orthodoxa from which opinions stem. So philosophy, science, and art want to tear open the firmament and plunge into the chaos. So I was wondering, what is the role of AI as an image of our thought or our understanding? Is an umbrella or is a tear that open to the firmament?
I mean, let me try something out. I mean, I think it's a beautiful quote there before we're putting it. I mean, there's always this sort of dual, at least two ways of thinking about AI and what it can do for us, where people like Daniel Dennett have been very clear and I think helpful in reminding us that we're building tools, not colleagues in this sense. And I think that applies for thinking about the role of AI in creativity. Yeah, it's a discovery tool, as a number of us have mentioned now. But then, of course, it's a metaphor for how we think and perceive and act as well. And here there's just this incredibly long history of how the dominant technology has been used as a metaphor for who we are and how we work. And AI is sort of the latest incarnation of that. It's just a little bit more explicit, the metaphorical this term, rather than just it happens to be a technology that we use, like a telephone exchange or something of that sort. But of course, like all metaphors, it's very limited, and we'll be misled if we take it too literally. And certainly from the sort of position that I see things looking around, we're in some ways at the limits of certainly the computational metaphor of the brain, and already kind of the sorts of AI architectures that people play with are less, they still run on computers, but they're less sort of explicitly computational in the sense that the things they do, we're using computers to simulate them rather than it being an explicitly computational process in the sense of symbolic reasoning and so on. So I think, quite what comes next is not clear. I mean, people talk vaguely about, metaphors in terms of large networks. The internet, of course, is now a popular metaphor. But I think yeah, we're this interesting phase where when people say things like the brain processes information, I mean, people used to get away with just saying that. A lot of people still try to get away with saying that as if it's obvious. But to me, there's absolutely nothing obvious about saying that the brain processes information. And there's everything to question about a statement like that in terms of what assumptions you're smuggling in about the kinds of things brains are, the kind of thing thinking is, and the kind of people we are.
Alexa, I want to give you some space to ask your question. Just to say, Alexa's from University of Michigan, collaborating with Matthias. And what we've got here, which is really what we're looking for, is a platform for a whole number of people, PhD students from across the world, frankly. So, Alexa.
Yeah, thank you. I first thank you all for your wonderful presentations. It's been really exciting and incredible to be part of this. I did my undergraduate degree in neuroscience and psychology, and now I'm in AI at the University of Michigan. And so it's been really cool to kind of hear about the cutting edge research that's been happening at the intersection between these two areas. So my question kind of is springboarding off of some of the comments that were made by Daniel and Anil about how I think one of the fundamental limitations of a lot of these networks that we use in design processes are that they are fixed. The way that time is dealt with is, there's the training time that happens where, networks learn patterns from these data sets, but then we try to apply them to real world scenarios and their weights are not updated at all. And so I was wondering if there are any more neuroscience-y mathematical models of neurons, like spiking neurons or whatnot, that any of you guys are using in your research, or if there's novel ways that how time processing is being integrated into these models.
That's a very good question, and actually, this is what I did my PhD on. In the sense that the way we interact with the world happens in real time, and we have real-time continuous control over our actions. And this is like, if you look at the very birth of AI, even before it was called AI, there was cybernetics. And so even the term of continuous control comes from cybernetics. And this is definitely not the dominant paradigm in deep learning. And the reason for that is, actually going back to the previous question, because what we have as AI today is basically a surveillance technology. And also the reason why it requires vast data is because that's the problem that it's trying to solve. Like, given this huge data sets, how can we extract some kind of meaningful information from it? So online learning is basically the term given to this kind of real-time learning. One of the areas that I'm really following closely is Numenta, Jeff Hawkins's research group. In fact, it was his book on intelligence, I think it was 2002, that first got me into this whole predictive processing way of thinking about, intelligence. So he's very much outside of this domain of what's happening right now with deep learning. And using a very different approach. As I'm not a neuroscientist, I can't comment on its legitimacy, but it's allegedly a much more neuroscience-inspired approach. So I've been keeping an eye on that as well. In my own work, I have done work with real-time training, and I think it's a very interesting idea to approach. It's very difficult though, because already these systems are so unpredictable, and if they're learning in real time as well, then it becomes even more difficult to control.
Alexa, can I ask you a question? And also maybe also Anil, one thing that always intrigues me about, because the title of this session is AI and neuroscience, but it always intrigues me that you trained as a neuroscientist and went into AI, and Anil went the opposite way around, went from AI into neuroscience. And Denis Osabis, I think, also did a kind of a PhD in neuroscience before going to computation. I think Geoffrey Hinton also. So I came to the conclusion that actually the quest for AI was the quest for intelligence itself. But I mean, how do you explain this kind of interface between these two different disciplines? It is really interesting to me.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Alexandra. I'll chip in after.
Oh, I mean, the primary thing that motivated me into switching between neuroscience, well, so I was doing computational neuroscience research, looking particularly at ways that we can apply functional models of brain activity to understanding actual physical anatomical connections between neurons. And so AI seemed like sort of a wonderful sandbox of ways to explore that, of taking simplified models and then evaluating their activity and how they behave, and comparing that to actual experimental measurements that we get from brain models of mice and rats and whatnot. And so I think that one really informs the other. And so that was, and for me personally, I couldn't work. I had an aversion to working with animal models, so that was also a motivation for switching over into AI. But yeah, I think that there's one can kind of be a mirror to the other, and one can serve as inspiration to the other as well.
And I'd go back to what Memo said about the historical roots of all these disciplines, that back in the 1940s, they were not separate. And there was this whole collection of, broadly speaking, cybernetics. Cybernetics gave birth both to what now seems to be AI proper, including deep learning. But there's this whole other sort of part of AI which was to do with real-time control, feedback control. Norbert Wiener's book was The Control of Communication in Man and Machine. And back in those days, I think discussions that we're having now were actually much more common. You had these collections of things like the Ratio Club and the Macy conferences in the US that brought together biologists, evolutionary biologists, sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, engineers, all trying to figure out the answer to the same sorts of questions. How do brains work? How do we build systems that do things similar to brains? And what's the social, cultural, and artistic relevance of these things? And over recent years, cybernetics kind of got a little bit lost in the fringes, but is now, I think is now coming back much more, with different labels, but things like Carl Friston's free energy principle is a modern reformulation of cybernetics. Whenever you put the emphasis back on control and feedback loops and so on, and action, then you're kind of, I think, reanimating some of these older threads in both of these fields. So yeah, we're just getting back to where we went on a long diversion where things seem more separate than they really should have been.
By the way, can we also think that in AI and neuroscience, which Neil is asking a really inspiring question, can we also maybe in a decade or so, quantum computation will make maybe another leap in this dialogue? Because I think that when we think about real-time models and the computational excessive problems of like reaching certain, computation, there's like a fundamental problem of classical computing here also. And maybe that leap that is a decade or so that, predictably, people are thinking there will be more accessible models in the AI and quantum computation. Perhaps this triangle will become another thing, right? And AI and neuroscience, maybe the quantum computation will come into the other edge of maybe the triangle will happen, maybe.
So I wanted to add something to Alexandra's point also about this kind of, we deal with this kind of issue of, networks that they are confined, let's say, within the data set that you input. And in architecture, for us, it's also super challenging, that aspect. And I think also Matthias and also Alexandra, I think you face the same issues. We are all doing similar research. So what we try to do together with Manos Dermiso and also Shermin Yusuf, so we started to look in a way at AI, not necessarily as, looking at all the images of buildings and then asking the AI to generate from their architecture, but we started in a way to look in a very discrete way to different topics in architecture or in an architecture project, and then try to address for each topic or each discrete task, in a way, try to address those tasks with different networks and then chain those networks together. Yeah. And in that way, then you end up with a sort of creative process more than necessarily that the network in a way it's confined within that data set. Yeah. So that's how we started to look in a way in going over that kind of limitation right now without actually changing necessarily the architectures of the networks. Maybe also Manos can expand a bit on that.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hi, hi, Anil. I have a question to you, actually, but also within today's discussion. My question is that since those AIs or machine learnings, they can create so-called original art design works. And according to the theory of PP, I mean, predictive processing, what are we really perceiving in front of these original works? Like very astonishing architectures we haven't seen before, they are flowing. So, I mean, according to the theory of PP, those kind of things are very beyond what we expected or beyond what we predicted. So seems like it's like will they be identified as predictive errors or I'm just wondering that these computational generated novel works might lack some accountabilities to some degrees. I'm just thinking this, or maybe that ways of our perceiving, how we're perceiving the world, how we're perceiving those computational generated works might haven't updated as fast as computations do. It's like a computation's abilities of creating goes much beyond, much faster than our humans' perception abilities or predictive abilities. Or we still need to increase or build, extend our perceptual context a priori. So these are my questions. Thank you.
It's good to see you again. I want to say thank you for showing me around Shanghai over a year ago. Anyway, thank you. That was great. But yeah, it's almost impossible to answer such a rich question, but I think the one very important distinction there is between what we take as, let's say, psychological surprise or psychological novelty and prediction error within a predictive processing or machine learning network, the kind of the personal and the subpersonal thing. So it's like when we encounter something that feels subjectively surprising to us, that is not identical with saying there's a prediction error in the network. I mean, they could be the same thing, but it's often a source of confusion. It goes right down to the use of all these kinds of Bayesian terms that people, we use belief, and you say the network has this belief, but that's really just saying the network represents or encodes a probability distribution of a particular kind. As Bayesian belief is just a probability distribution. It's not necessarily something the subject, the person, explicitly believes. So surprise or prediction error in a network is also not necessarily something that a person experiences as novel or surprising. And I think it's an open question, at what point do we experience something as novel or surprising? How is that perceptual experience depend on the underlying mechanics of prediction error minimization? Is it something to do with the rate of change of prediction error, or is it prediction error at a particular hierarchical level? What exactly is it? To me, it's unclear. It's a very good question. Don't know who else wants to chip in.
Yeah, so you think that we shouldn't regard perceiving those works as a personal experience, but we should look at those experiences from a hierarchical networking perspective. It's like we will always go through this hierarchical filtering or processing process.
Yeah. I think the point was just, it's again about being a bit wary of being over literal about these metaphors. So there's something, there's this process that probably something like it is going on in the brain, and it uses, but we should not fall into the trap of, again, identifying psychological constructs with particular aspects of that mechanism.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to just see if there are other voices out there who would like to ask some questions.
I would like to ask one, if possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you everyone for a great discussion. I've been listening and it's really, really interesting. It's also very nice to meet so many of you here that I follow very regularly, I think, in social media. It's nice. I wanted to actually, like most of you said, I wanted to use my biases and guide the discussion to where those lead. And I want to go back to the idea of control hallucination. And I think it's apparent in this discussion, and actually both in art and in architecture, that the focus has been hallucination. And my bias is towards control. And what I'm trying to understand exactly is not how to hallucinate, to use generative models, for example, to hallucinate things, or even understand how we can hallucinate, but how can I control this hallucination to design or develop something useful, something practical, something, you know, that solves a certain problem in the world. And I'm trying to understand from the neuroscience point of view, how do we do that? And I think, Anil, in your discussion you mentioned, and in your TED talk you mentioned even more deeply, these two worlds of the inner and the outside, right? And when you were describing the inner, it felt to me a bit, not so conscious, but subconscious, in the sense that there are some processes going on that have absolute control. I mean, there are ranges of temperature and, you know, like heart rate and all this stuff, but the control, the reasoning is always there, kind of keeping them in the range. While when you're talking about the outer side, you know, that control was not so fixed. There was, so I want to understand, if you can explain to someone else, what is the function of control in hallucination in this, and how do we regulate it if we do? I'm not sure. And is the idea that the subconscious, like the conscious experience, is maybe the subconscious being broken, like fragments of an absolute control that come out, or is it something else that we do more consciously then? So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I hope it's an interesting question.
I guess I'll start again with where I keep talking too much in this discussion, but and there are two senses, at least, of control that I think we should distinguish in the term controlled hallucination. There's the first, I think, very simple sense in which sensory data is controlling the perceptual prediction. You have a perceptual prediction and it's compared against sensory data and updated. There's that sense of control. You can think of it as feedback from sensory data. But that can kind of go on even in you just imagine you're just sitting there looking at the world, you're not doing anything. So there's a kind of passive sense that the organism as a whole is not controlling anything in this case, but sensory data is controlling the perceptual inference. But then there's this other sense of control where predictions are not just trying to figure out what's there, they're used for regulation. And this goes back to Memo's point about cybernetics again, that predictive models, generative models, are useful not only for figuring out what's out there, but for controlling and regulating things. In fact, that might be the reason the brain predicts anything, is to control, in the first instance, the body, the interior of the body, but then other things too. And if you can predict the future behavior of a system, you can control it much, much better. And so think about vision again for a second. About another example, compared to just looking at a scene, might be if you're trying to catch a ball. So somebody throws a ball towards you. Now, what people tend to do in this case is not just sort of figure out where the ball is going to land and then run there. You actually control the perceptual variable. You know, you'll move so as to maintain the angle of the ball to horizon in a particular way. So you move so as the ball appears to you in a particular way. This is now an active form of control that you are updating. You're changing your actions to keep a perceptual variable regulated within bounds, so that you'll end up intercepting the ball. It'll hit you between the eyes, and you have to do something different at the last minute. And that's interesting to me because the phenomenology is different. You know, you don't perceive the ball now as having a particular location in space, at least not primarily. You perceive it in terms of its, you know, what Gibson might have called its catchability. And so there's a sort of way in which predictions appear in your experience that I think depends on what they're being used for. So predictions that are geared towards control will seem to us different from predictions that are geared towards figuring out where stuff is. And this gets again back to this point that so much has been learned from just having people look at scenes and describe them and see what's going on in the brain. But actually, we very rarely do that. Most of our perception is active. It's guiding our behavior all the time. And that's how things seem in our perceptual experience all the time, but it's just more difficult to study.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know if I can just add on that. I just, this question that Theodoros was just asking, I think that is very close to my mind as well. And in our research, we are also looking to maybe not a control, but I don't know, but something which is not hallucination, not a glitch, but probably a newfound pattern. Now, so we are looking through the GAN techniques or through the different types of machine learning. We are trying to find a new strangeness, but a new strange pattern. And I think that when we are coming to the hallucination, basically I perceive hallucination as a kind of perception which has a lack of external stimuli. So basically you are quite an abstract in a certain set of data, and you're creating hallucination based on the very limited set of data. And I think that as soon as we are relying on the so it's basically coming to the question of how we can work with a different set of data in order to start training the networks now. So, and as soon as we have an access to the larger sets of data which are becoming the input, I think here this pattern is emerging from the hallucination to the more precisioncy.
Can I add something here, and maybe just as a complementary thing, and maybe also Anil will be amazing if you can expand on this. What do you think is the importance of this kind of relay, or this kind of almost like dreaming in all this kind of creative processes? Because I think in neuroscience, there were many experiments, I think, with rats trying to solve a maze. And it's almost like in this kind of relay phase, it's almost like the brain of the rat start to reimagine or remember in a way the moves that they did.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff in machine learning that I think you guys know more than me about using dreaming, for instance, as a way of avoiding catastrophic forgetting in networks. I think this comes back to an earlier question about time, right? I mean, we humans, we organisms, we engage in continual learning. We just we're constantly exposed to new stimuli, and we don't forget. Well, I forget a lot. We don't forget everything. And we can learn to do one thing and we can learn to do another thing without forgetting the previous thing. This is a big challenge for machine learning architectures. How can they learn something new without their performance on the first task becoming disastrously poor? And there are many sort of proposed solutions to how this might happen, but one of them is called generative replay, where basically it means that you're kind of, you're replaying past episodes that now alternate with new episodes, so that in that way you ensure the network doesn't lose the capacity that it was first trained on. So that that could be one machine learning inspired theory for what dreaming is all about. Another one is that you're just trying to normalize the models that you learn. So there's in learning, there's always this trade-off between generalization and accuracy. You have too accurate fit. You overfit, then you can't generalize. And so if you free run a generative model, you kind of normalize it so that it might generalize better in the future. So I think there's really interesting hypotheses that have absolutely shit all to do with Freud, Neil, about what dreams are for.
Maybe I can just ask a question. I mean, one thing that's always kind of like, to what extent, what's the role of memory in consciousness? I mean, it just seems to me like I was reading Ray Kurzweil and said the reason why we had a brain in the first place was to predict, but you can't predict unless you've got a memory of what happened before in order to predict. So, it seems to me like that memory must be absolutely fundamental to the domain of consciousness.
Relative to that, Neil, I wanted to follow up on Anil's comment, and but I think what you just said is also kind of fairly relevant, because there was this comment earlier about the combinational creativity, right? And the fact that also a lot of people are talking about the notion of time with regards to how we process it. And I think there's two important things to remember. First, that the benchmark for assessing creative thinking is not consistent, unlike that of assessing intelligence, but also within the particular actions of a creative sequence within a person, this is also not consistent. And I think that perhaps we could link it to memory. I was thinking of Boden's description of the notion of relevance, and how there is this conceptual distance that we have to traverse in order to create certain associations. And that tolerance of that distance is not the same in different people. For example, she mentions that within surrealists, this was a much greater thing, and so I'm wondering, with regards how we can begin to connect perhaps perception and memory with regards to patience. I don't know if that could be somehow a trait that could perhaps enhance someone's tolerance within that, but also, I guess, the cumulative buildup of experience and the access of that experience through memory could also help some particular, let's say the same individual within a particular period of time generate a new idea, which of course, right now we know that, neural network is not, capable of, performing this sort of task unless, through transfer learning or otherwise similar processes.
An interesting thing I just want to add there is, a memory is, if I understand correctly, so, a memory is not something that we store, but even a memory is a reconstruction based on the model that we have of ourselves and our past. So if my interpretation of it is that ultimately all we have is some kind of a predictive model, and the memories that we recall are actually being reconstructed based on who we are at that point in time. So we interpret the past through who we are right now as well. So I just wanted to add that, because a memory in a computational term, like it would be very problematic to compare a memory to storing a file and loading a file. Rather, in fact, I did a project in one of my, I didn't show it today, a neural network learning in real time from a camera. And it had memory, but it had a very weird memory such that it was trying to reconstruct what it saw. And if I would hold my phone up, it would remember this. If I lifted my hand up without my phone, it would still put the phone in my hand, because that's what it thinks should be at the end of my hand. And I think that's closer to how we actually have memories to the idea of recalling files.
Yeah, that's super important. I mean, memory is certainly not like, that's another place where this over literal computational analogy fails. Memory is, in fact, for kind of episodic memories, the more frequently you recall them, the less accurate they become, which is a huge problem for things like eyewitness testimony. But also there are many different forms of memory. And this gets back, I think, to your point, Neil. So we often, when we talk about memory, we often naturally think about autobiographical or episodic memory, specific events that happen that we can recollect or regenerate, rather, as Memo said. But then there's working memory, like what's the phone number somebody just told you, and then can you remember that? Can you remember what you need to get from the supermarket? There's procedural memory, learning a new skill. Memory is so general; it's basically any kind of persisting change in a system. And when you talk about the memory needed for prediction, you can talk about a very minimal form of memory. It doesn't have to be sort of explicit episodic recall kind of memory.
And I'd just like to add another thing about a previous question regarding dreaming, because it's very related. It's also related to the question about time, in that, in a way, at least from a computational point of view, not in us, but dreaming is a way to imagine alternate scenarios, so that we don't necessarily have to learn interacting with the world. But if we can build an accurate enough model of the world, then we can interact with our model, and we can interact with that model at way faster than we can interact with the real world, and then we can learn from that. And this is actually how a lot of this is how AlphaGo works. AlphaGo, AlphaZero, that works. That beats superhuman chess and Go. Superhuman chess is not difficult, but superhuman Go, in that it uses an agent-based Monte Carlo tree search. And what it's doing is it's effectively evaluating simulations. It's dreaming different moves. And this is a way of, trying to see what move to take. But what's really novel about the way that they do it is that they also build in, pardon my really sloppy speculative language here, but they build intuition into it, in the sense that one of the biggest challenges in Go was that there's no way of explicitly formulating a way of looking at the state of a board and quantitatively assessing who is in the lead. As you can do that with chess, but you can't do it with Go. Whereas human experts have an intuition. They can look at the board and they can say, I think white's leading. And there was no way of formulating that computationally until a neural network was trained on this. And so the really interesting thing with that system is they use a convolutional neural network, but that's just part of the overarching system. It's not a convolutional neural network. There's a convolutional neural network, which kind of metaphorically is similar to maybe the visual cortex, but they have a Monte Carlo tree search, which is the decision-making predictive part of the architecture. They have a reinforcement learning system, which is part of the replay to build understanding. So it's the way that these architectures are strung together, which is where you start to see intelligence. And actually linking back to a previous question about, can these really be creative? I would say absolutely yes. And going back to actually one use question, a very amazing thing happened in AlphaGo in, I think it was the third game, when one of the commentators, like a 9Dan commentator, said, oh, that wasn't a good move. Why did AlphaGo do that? And then 20 moves later, he was like, oh. So basically, there's novelty involved, and then there's appreciation of novelty. If something is too novel and we can't appreciate it, then it has no value to us. And this also goes back to, I think, Gia's question as well. So there's a certain level of novelty that we need, that we can appreciate it. Otherwise, we don't think it's valuable and we don't think it's creative. But I think AlphaGo definitely demonstrated creativity. It's time-based, it's real time, as in it unfolds in time, which is essential. In fact, it was so creative that we couldn't even appreciate the value of its moves until 20 moves later.
My understanding here is that, and maybe Anil can correct me here, my understanding is that there is a very close relation between memory and imagination. So memory, we were saying that it's a reconstructive process, and imagination, we can say that it's a sort of constructive process, yeah? You're trying to imagine something that will happen in the future, and you're trying to build in a way, or to construct that imagination. And I'm saying this also, maybe it has to do with where probably imagination and memory happen in the brain, like in hippocampus. And I think there was also research done for Alzheimer patients where they were testing in a way this kind of problem of spatial coherency problem, or how it's called, where they are trying to just to suggest in a way to a patient, like, you are on the beach. So try to explain what do you see on the beach, or like try to imagine what you have on that beach, yeah? And usually these kind of patients with Alzheimer, they have very big problems in imagining, in a way, constructing, not only reconstructing their memories, but also constructing or imagine things.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well. There's sometimes people use the more generic term, like mental time travel, because you can go forwards and backwards. And yeah, a lot of interesting animal studies actually have looked at this and shown, sort of scrub jays can remember things, but they also can plan for the future. And it's interesting to think, is memory a kind of evolutionary side effect of the ability to plan? Which is the more important, but they're very deeply interlinked. but they're also, you know, they're not exactly the same, right? So there are people vary, for instance, in the degree of the vividness of their visual imagery. And imagery is, of course, not quite the same thing as imaginations. I don't know quite how to define that specifically because it overlaps with so many things. But you know, people can lack vivid visual imagery and still have good memory. But yeah, your main point is well taken, that the ability to remember the past is very tightly linked to our ability to project into the future.
By the way, I was trying to search something that I heard almost a year ago. There's one research, I guess, in University of Tel Aviv, I guess, or the group with the place cells and the grid cells research group going on. There was this one speculation says, the more we remember, the more we actually forget certain details of a certain event. So there is pretty much no chance of remembering the same sense, same moment with the same condition of that happened in time and space. And apparently, of course, in certain cases, and some people apparently have some, you know, different conditions. But I'm trying to find it was so poetic. Like the more you remember, the more you have a chance to forget a certain details. It's a very deconstructive thinking than many, you know, things we talk about AI, and it's pretty interesting phenomena if it's true. I mean, I would say it was a research actually. I'm trying to find it. It was really interesting.
We should we need to wrap up soon because this has been fantastic, but I think everyone's getting a little exhausted, especially in China. I just want to ask one final question to Anil, because I mean, thank you so much for being here. It's been really amazing. You've been fielding all these kind of questions like your father playing badminton, I think. But no, one thing I'd say is we had a discussion last week about creativity. Now, I know it's a difficult kind of question, but one of the comments made by Melanie Mitchell is that she says you can't be creative unless you're conscious. Now, my hunch is that actually you're conscious in that you're evaluating what you've done, but the creative act, like the kind of light bulb going off, is maybe an unconscious thing that we're not even aware of it. Could you maybe give a brief comment on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I find it very hard to know what statements like that mean. You know, that try to draw this very clear, bright line between what is in the land of consciousness and what is not in the land. It almost seems to be sort of some hidden dualism going on there, that certain things, you know, all our conscious perceptions depend on unconscious processes. We're not aware of our brain activity. This is kind of should be a self-evident starting point. And I think your intuition is quite right that there could be many things that contribute to what we end up calling creative, and many of these things can churn along under the hood for a while. I mean, some of them might be conscious, and then there's these beautiful examples of, by necessity relatively anecdotal of people reaching insights in dreams. In the dream, the Kerkelei's discovery of the structure of benzene, a famous example of a insight, came to him in a dream, and many other examples, I'm sure. Or it could be something that we consciously experience in the moment. I find those sorts of strong statements about what's conscious and what's not just, in this case, Melanie Mitchell's brilliant stuff on AI, but I think that sort of unhelpfully tries to simplify that particular dialogue.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up. I mean, it seems a shame, but I mean, this has been astonishing. I mean, it's been astonishing in any ways because, of the discussion going on, and we'll put it online, this whole thing. It's been astonishing also in terms of an experiment to see what we could do in terms of establishing a platform. This is something that Philip, Yuan, and I have been dreaming about, this kind of global platform that kind of brings people together, and you have these kind of this discussions. Almost feels like the Macy conferences kind of reenacted in some way online in a kind of a curious sort of way. But I think it's something that we can build upon. I would just like to thank everyone for taking part in this. This is something that is, I think, something new that happened. I mean, Philip Beasley made some comment about this on the chat about so let's hope we can build upon this. Can I just thank everyone for their generosity of their thoughts and everything. I really have the most astonishing thing was we brought together Memo and Anil, who were living probably close to one another for a long time without knowing that. And I was in Brighton. I lived most of my life in Sussex as well. So it's great to have you all here together. So thank you, and I hope that we can build upon this. I would love to bring Andy into one of these kind of sessions. I know that that there are people on our team who'd love to talk to him too. So thank you so much, and thank you especially those who contributed to the presentations, but also to the questions in the channel, and also some questions we didn't get a chance to deal with, but from the live stream on Bilibili and YouTube. This has been an amazing event. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Neil,
so
and
much.
thank you.
Great to be here together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thanks, Neil, for organizing.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks. Thank you, team. Thank you, the team that's behind this as well. Thank you, Diana and Sam. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.